The map room at Yokosuka Naval Base breathed with quiet purpose. A single lantern swayed from the ceiling, casting soft ripples of light over charts that stretched from Formosa to the Aleutians. Captain Takeshi Sato, a strategist with eyes like sharpened glass, traced the sea lanes with the back of his pen. Around him, young officers stood motionless, their uniforms pressed, their faces drawn with the calm assurance of men who believed destiny had already spoken. On the table, red pins marked imagined victories: the Philippines, Guam, and perhaps even Hawaii. Every inch of the Pacific was treated like a chessboard of inevitability. Outside, the scent of salt and steel hung heavy in the winter air. Japan's empire had modernized with brutal speed, its navy, now the pride of the rising sun. The Admiralty called their submarines Keigun Sensuikan, naval war dragons. They were built not to hunt commerce, but to shadow fleets and strike when honor demanded. No one in that dimly lit room yet knew that the war dragons would soon meet an enemy that learned faster than prophecy itself. Dawn unfolded gently across the harbor as the submarine I-4 slipped from her berth. Her diesel engines hummed with a low metallic rhythm, a sound that echoed in the chests of every man aboard. Lieutenant Nakamura, barely 28, stood on the conning tower, his gloved hand resting on the periscope housing as mist rolled across the deck. The sea was calm, a mirror reflecting Japan's growing power. Below him, sailors in white caps adjusted depth gauges and oiled brass fittings with near-religious care. Training manuals were written in precise, poetic language: strike unseen, retreat unseen. The doctrine came not from experience but from admiration of Mahan's Western theories, of Britain's old imperial fleet, and of an unshakable faith in divine order. The submarines were scouts for the battle fleet, not lone assassins. They were to serve the Emperor's surface ships, not replace them. What no one dared whisper was that such honor-bound restraint would one day become their undoing. At the Naval Academy in Etajima, cadets marched across the parade ground beneath banners embroidered with the words Keigun no Eiyo, glory of the Navy. In the lecture halls, instructors spoke of strategy as though it were mathematics, certain and eternal. Charts showed enemy formations neatly collapsing under Japanese precision. The cadets believed it. They were taught that courage, not curiosity, won wars, that the West had grown soft, and that the Empire of Japan alone carried the discipline of the sea. When night fell, they gathered on the docks to watch training submarines vanish into black water, their running lights glowing faintly like distant fireflies. The scent of diesel and salt clung to their uniforms like memory. For them, submarines were instruments of destiny, not invention. They saw the ocean as obedient, something to be conquered, not something that might teach in return. In 1936, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then still a rising officer, toured the docks and observed the Navy's new undersea fleet. He admired their craftsmanship, the gleaming torpedo tubes, the reinforced hulls, the precision of Japanese engineering. Yet even he sensed something missing. The submarines were fast and proud, but they lacked the cunning instinct of a predator. Their missions were still scripted to serve the surface battleship, not the freedom of independent warfare. They follow too many rules, he murmured to an aide, as a crew saluted from the deck below. But his warning was buried under the optimism of expansion. New territories, new ambitions, new dreams of Pacific mastery. No one imagined that in just a few years these same waters would swallow those dreams whole. By the late 1930s, Japan's submarine captains drilled endlessly in formation attacks. Exercises simulated perfect coordination with fleet movements. but undersea vessels striking as invisible extensions of the Emperor's will. Each maneuver was measured to perfection, a ballet of angles and depths. But beneath the precision lay a hidden flaw, the belief that war would unfold according to plan. Officers joked quietly about the Americans, merchants pretending to be sailors. Few had seen an American submarine, and fewer still respected one. In the calm of those years, confidence hardened into certainty. The Pacific seemed endless, yet their understanding of it was painfully small. Inside the steel corridors of the I-6, humidity beaded along pipes as engines growled through the night. The crew, packed shoulder to shoulder, worked in silence. Ensign Okada, new to sea duty, stared at a photograph of his family pinned beside the pressure gauge. He wondered what the war would feel like, whether it would come as quickly as the newspapers promised. Above him, the captain adjusted course toward the South China Sea, tracing a training path through waters that would soon become battlefields. The air smelled of oil and anticipation. These men were professionals, their routines rehearsed to the minute, their belief unshakable, but none of them had ever fired a torpedo in combat. They were perfect soldiers waiting for an imperfect war. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff prepared for expansion into Southeast Asia. Meetings stretched late into the night, lit by cigarette smoke and the rustle of silk uniforms. Admiral Nagano Asami reviewed intelligence reports suggesting American industrial growth, yet his staff dismissed it as statistical fantasy. "They have no stomach for war," one junior officer said. The room nodded. Japan's fleet was unmatched in quality, its training relentless, its spirit unbreakable. But faith in perfection breeds blindness. While they plotted dominance, the Americans quietly studied their engineers, their factories, their restless inventors. The future was already assembling in foundries they had chosen to ignore. The storm was forming, but it sounded only like distant thunder. That winter, as the first snow fell over Yokosuka, a submarine returned from maneuvers and disappeared into fog. Its flag fluttered faintly above the conning tower, red against the pale horizon. The officers on shore saluted, their boots crunching against frost, believing they stood at the dawn of a new age of mastery. Japan's undersea force was strong, elegant, and disciplined, but untested in the chaos of a true global war. The admirals believed skill would conquer uncertainty, and spirit would conquer adaptation. History would soon challenge both. In their minds, the oceans were already theirs. They just had to collect the surrender. Steam hissed through the cramped control room of the USS 38, a relic of another era forced into a new war. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, pooling near the chart table where Lieutenant John Calloway wiped his forehead with an oil-stained sleeve. The gauges trembled faintly as the engines rumbled below, vibrating the very air. Sweat and diesel mixed into a scent that clung to everything: steel, clothing, even breath. The Pacific above was vast and indifferent, a ceiling of blue pressing down on men who felt forgotten by their own navy. The crew's eyes flicked between dials and the captain's hand resting on the periscope, waiting for something. An order, a chance, a miracle. Through the lens, a Japanese freighter slid silently across the horizon. Oblivious. "Fire one," Calloway whispered. The torpedo streaked forward, leaving a silver trail of bubbles that faded too soon. It struck nothing, and in that empty sound, America's undersea war truly began. Reports filtered back to Pearl Harbor like ghosts. Torpedo failed to detonate, hit confirmed. Target survived. Weapon ran erratic. Officers read them with disbelief. Red ink marking patterns no one wanted to admit. The Mark 14 torpedo, once hailed as the Navy's most advanced, had betrayed them all. Its magnetic exploder misread the Earth's field, detonating early or not at all. Its depth mechanism sank deeper than set, gliding harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. In Washington, admirals insisted the weapon was sound. It must be the crews who failed. In the wardrooms, resentment brewed. Captains whispered that the ocean itself seemed to mock them. What they didn't yet know was that the fault lay not in their courage, but in their faith in machines that had never been tested in truth. On board the USS Tautog, Commander William Red, Fenno leaned over the plotting table, his patience fraying with every malfunctioning shot. His crew had risked everything, a bold night attack through narrow Philippine waters, only to see every torpedo run wild. The sound man had counted 4 perfect hits. The ocean had delivered none. Now, in the dead silence after failure, the men could hear their own heartbeat echoing in the hull. Fenno's voice cracked through the intercom, steady but hollow. "We did our job, men. The rest wasn't ours to control." Around him, faces sagged in exhaustion, the air heavy with diesel and defeat. He knew their enemy was efficient, alert, merciless. No one imagined that these early humiliations would one day teach America how to win a silent war. Back in Pearl Harbor, the Submarine Force Command faced an uncomfortable truth. The United States had entered a modern war with a fleet built for the last one. The S-class subs were obsolete, shallow diving, noisy, underpowered. Their captains had trained for fleet reconnaissance, not commerce destruction. Yet after the attack on Pearl, the Pacific was no longer a chessboard of grand strategy. It was a battlefield of attrition. Every commander now understood that isolation meant extinction. Engineers scrambled to diagnose the torpedo failures. Bureaucrats denied. The officers on shore felt as if they were waging 2 wars, one against Japan and another against disbelief in Washington. The price of learning would be measured in ships lost and men who vanished without vindication. The film camera of history lingers now inside the mess hall of the USS Pollock. The air is thick, hot, and trembling with the deep growl of submerged engines. Crewmen eat in silence, each lost in thought, their food sliding across tin plates as the submarine sways gently with the current. Above them, depth charges detonate, distant, then closer. Dust falls from the light fixtures. The men stare upward as though they could see through the steel. Chief Petty Officer Mendez mutters a prayer in Spanish, gripping the table's edge. The explosions fade, leaving only the faint hum of the motor. Relief tastes like metal. They survived another day, but survival without success felt like failure whispered through steel. In the months after Pearl Harbor, U.S. submarines prowled the Philippine and Dutch East Indies waters. Bold but blind, they fired dozens of torpedoes, sinking few ships and losing even more confidence. Captains like Morton, Dealey, and O'Kane began keeping private logs, unauthorized records of torpedo malfunctions. The Navy refused to acknowledge. These reports read like quiet acts of rebellion. Each failed strike became a mystery to solve, each survivor a witness to error. Yet amid frustration, something else stirred. Innovation. Crews began experimenting with firing angles, manual depth settings, even modified detonators built from scavenged parts. No one in Washington noticed, but beneath the waves, the learning had already begun. By mid-1942, the morale crisis reached a quiet breaking point. Commanders returned from patrols with empty result sheets, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Promotions slowed, investigations multiplied. Yet the same men volunteered for another tour. They were not chasing glory. They were chasing understanding. Lieutenant Ed Beach, later famous for his calm brilliance, once wrote, Each failure was a page torn from a manual that had never been written. Slowly, the shape of a new doctrine began to form. Aggressive, adaptive, patient. The men started thinking less like soldiers and more like engineers, less like hunters and more like students of the sea. The ocean had become their teacher, and its lessons were written in cold precision and silent endurance. When the USS Groningen failed to return from her first patrol, the base commander at Dutch Harbour stood on the pier and stared out to where the horizon dissolved into grey. Somewhere beneath that line lay 58 men who had given everything and achieved nothing measurable, yet their loss was not wasted. Every misfire, every sunken hope, every empty patrol log added weight to the argument that change was necessary. New leaders were emerging, pragmatic, fearless, willing to question doctrine. They would soon demand answers, and the tide would begin to turn. But for now the ocean remained vast, and their voices still small against it. They sailed home in silence, carrying lessons written in the language of failure. Flames licked the horizon beyond Leyte. As the hull of the USS Pampanito slid through glassy water, the orange blaze reflected like a second sky across her black steel. Inside the narrow control room, sonar men leaned forward, their forearms braced against sweating panels while needles jittered with distant echoes. Lieutenant Frank Monroe whispered coordinates into a clipped voice, watching the screen for any anomaly that might become a target. Above them, the night air smelled of burning oil and something older, the sulphur of ships dying far from home. On deck, lookouts spoke in low tones as distant silhouettes of Japanese freighters trudged through lighted lanes, unaware of the dark beneath. Depth charges had become a spoken threat, not a rumor, and every splash on the surface made hearts count and breath shorten. Radio silence held like a thin skin over each vessel, brittle and taut. The sea itself reflected both fire and starlight, an indifferent witness to sudden violence. Men below held photographs, letters, brass dog tags. They measured their lives by the beat of engines and the rhythm of patrol. In those hours, the Pacific felt less like a passage and more like a test, a private exam for any navy that dared to call itself master of the waves. Across thousands of miles in a Tokyo war room, officers traced convoy routes with practiced fingers and spoke in tones that mixed triumph with calculation. Admiral Shigematsu Takenaka read reports of territorial gains and believed the logistics would follow like obedient shadows. Convoys moved under disciplined formation, fuel tankers snug between escort destroyers, their lights dimmed to a painful half so as not to offend the night. On board those transports, dockworkers and conscripts stowed rice, rubber, and oil with the same efficiency used to feed a nation at war. The Japanese viewed the ocean as a controlled avenue, a conveyor belt for empire, and they trusted their doctrine to secure it. But in the bowels of enemy submarines, American crews took notes on every missed convoy, every evasive maneuver, and every lull in escort patterns. These quiet observations were not yet strategy. They were raw data, scribbled on the backs of ration menus in cramped bunks. What they didn't yet know was that this patient record-keeping would become the scaffolding of a new way to fight beneath the waves. The next months would not be decided by sight alone, but by the careful science of learning and adaptation. The I-boat captains felt the same sea differently. For them, night navigation had a ceremonial calm. Lieutenant Masaru Fuji steered with a practiced hand, trusting periscopes and charts earned through years of regimented training. He could see the American convoys in the distance like a line of pale teeth, and imagined the honor of striking at surface warships in grand, decisive clashes. His crew polished brass and hummed old march songs as the sub slipped through moonlit swells. each man confident in Japan's doctrine of fleet-centered victory. Yet proximity breeds observation, and as Fuji's periscope passed over the stern of a freighter, he noticed subtle changes, zigzag patterns that were slight but deliberate, a new radio silence discipline, smaller lifeboats lashed differently. Those small adaptations, invisible to doctrine but visible to men who watched, would prove costly to ignore. In the cramped dark below, sailors who had been trained for river-like logistics began to sense that the sea itself was learning new ways to hide and to hunt. No one imagined this would become the theatre where improvisation outpaced pride. The gulf between plan and practice widened, measured not by broad battles but by 1,000 small decisive habits. On an American submarine tin-stained with salt, Petty Officer James Arnett scrubbed a periscope lens until his fingers throbbed, then peered out to count the lights of a convoy threading past Samar. The men had started timing every escort pass, noting the frequency of sonar pings and the length of search patterns. Where doctrine had been absent or wrong, empirical patience filled the gap. They learned to expect the unexpected. Commanders like Murray Thompson began to circle reports together in the wardroom, comparing angles of approach, dusk timings and torpedo performance. They swapped techniques in hushed conversations, approach slower, fire at different ranges, set depths manually rather than trust the instrument. Each small experiment yielded a result, sometimes a success, often another failure, but always a lesson. These quiet workshops of war changed the shape of patrols. Ships that had been aimless were now laboratories. What they didn't yet know was how quickly cumulative tinkering would outmatch rigid tradition. That gradual accumulation of tweaks would soon become a doctrine of its own. Destroyer captains on the escort screens felt the creeping unease too, their white wakes slicing through night. Like questions, Petty Officer Tadashi Kuroda, on a Japanese destroyer, watched periscope wakes vanish under moonlight, and ordered immediate depth charge patterns as a show of control, rather than from confirmed contact. Men practiced the ritual of hunting, cones of sonar sweeps, the slow math of triangulation, and performed the choreography with grim discipline. Yet the American submarines had begun to alter their timing, to stagger attacks at hours when the escorts anticipated sleep, to exploit harvestable gaps in the midnight routines. Each missed contact educated both sides. Every premature depth charge taught submarine men where not to be visible. The ocean between the convoys was no longer neutral. It had become a tutor, punishing the naive and rewarding the observant. What they didn't yet know was that the patience of a few crews would accumulate into an edge that no single ship could neutralize. The war in those waters would increasingly reward those who treated silence like an ally and error like a textbook. The night off Mindanao held a tableau. An American sub slipped through oil-slick reflections, while Japanese searchlights cut arcs through smoke and rain. The Pampanito's periscope recorded the convoy's zigzag rhythm in precise degrees. The crew logged speed, bearing, and the timing of escort sweeps to the nearest second. Back at a forward base, analysts compared multiple logs and began to extract patterns, not grand plans but repeating habits. Suddenly, a map room became a classroom where raw patrol notes turned into attack schedules. Engineers worked on torpedoes with newfound urgency, adjusting exploders, rechecking depth settings, and rigging temporary fixes from spares. Men who had once cursed machinery now began to speak of it with the reverence of someone who trusted a partner's reliability. No one imagined this would become a matter of survival rather than pride. Slowly, the American submarine force turned from a collection of frustrated boats into a learning organization, an ecosystem of observation and modification that used failure as a teacher, the implications would ripple outward like the quiet waves left by a periscope. On the Japanese side, the Admiralty convened urgent councils where maps and telegrams were spread more quickly than ever before. Admiral Yamashita, poring over steaming charts, could not reconcile the scale of merchant losses with the confidence of reports that had once been routine. Convoys changed routes, escorts thickened, and radar installations were pushed to improve detection ranges. Yet every adjustment demanded fuel, men, and time that the Empire could scarcely spare. Small villages that fed the war machine began to notice fewer ships returning with cargo. Factory floors slowed, ration lists lengthened. For crews afloat, supply shortages meant harder turns at sea and fewer maintenance opportunities. Meanwhile, American captains read this unraveling in the field and learned to push attacks where logistics hurt most. Fuel, food, rubber. What they didn't yet know was how decisive a maritime chokehold could become when applied with cunning rather than force alone. The balance of empire and endurance began to tilt, not with a single climactic battle, but with steady attrition that the ocean's new students practiced without fanfare. Dawn broke over a sea that had learned new languages of movement and silence, and in that light both navies saw the contours of a changed war. Survivors on rafts told hushed stories of torpedoes that found their marks when angles and timing finally aligned, and those stories fed the hungry notebooks of submarine tacticians. In the rear, shipyards adjusted schedules, engineers refiled blueprints, and captains rewrote patrol orders based on hard-earned field science. The Japanese Admiralty, once certain, began to tally not just ships lost, but the retailers of supply and morale that those ships carried in the dark water below. Something ancient stirred, not fear but resolve. The ocean had become an instructor whose lessons were cruel and efficient, and both sides would leave its classroom changed forever. The war would not be decided by a single voice but by the chorus of countless small corrections, each one teaching the next to do better. The rain outside Pearl Harbor tapped against the tin roof of a converted warehouse where folding tables had replaced ceremony. Cigarette smoke drifted through the air as Commander Charles Lockwood, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, leaned over a map of the South Pacific covered in red grease pencil marks. Around him, a dozen submarine captains studied enemy convoy patterns sketched hastily on butcher paper. The men were tired, faces drawn from sleepless patrols, eyes rimmed with salt and doubt. But in that small room, something shifted. Complaint became conversation, and conversation became doctrine. "We can't fight the war we want," Lockwood said quietly. "Only the one we have." They listened, not because of his rank, but because every man there had already seen a torpedo fail in darkness. A chalkboard listed names of lost boats: Grunion, Shark, Trout, Pickerel, reminders that perfection cost time they no longer had. Outside, the Pacific roared against the breakwater, indifferent yet listening. What none of them realized was that the answers they sought would come not from orders above, but from mistakes below. At dawn, the shipyard stirred with new purpose. Engineers in oil-stained uniforms huddled beneath floodlights beside a dissected Mark 14 torpedo, laid open like a metal autopsy. They traced wiring faults, tested exploders, and recalibrated gyros until sparks flared from the test bench. Chief Technician Henry Bruckner marked each failure with a steady pencil line, recording angles, speeds, and strike depths on worn graph paper. For months they had been blamed for incompetence. Now they were proving the weapon itself was unworthy. In the clang of wrenches and the hiss of acetylene torches, redemption began to take shape. The men worked without orders, driven by something deeper, an anger that demanded precision. Each new test brought a burst of hope and then a fresh setback. Yet in that cycle of trial and error lay something sacred, the stubborn belief that truth existed and that they could reach it through persistence. No one imagined that this sleepless workshop would redefine the deadliest weapon beneath the waves. In training rooms across Fremantle and Brisbane, young captains gathered around chalk diagrams of convoys like pupils. At a new kind of university, the lectures were stripped of pomp. Every sentence was written in blood and failure. Commander Swede Momsen, survivor of past disasters, instructed them to think like engineers, not heroes. "If you can't change the sea," he said, "change how you move through it." He introduced new maneuvers, angled approaches, night surface attacks, coordinated timing that broke old restrictions. Charts became battlefields for ideas, and even the junior officers began challenging superiors with data instead of deference. The atmosphere felt electric, impatient. In the corridors, chalk dust mixed with sweat and diesel fumes, a strange perfume of urgency and invention. The U.S. submarine force was no longer memorizing doctrine. It was writing one. Every erased line on the chalkboard became a step toward mastery. Aboard the USS Wahoo, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush, Morton studied the sea through binoculars. His crew, silent as dawn, turned the horizon grey. Behind him, Executive Officer Richard O'Kane tracked bearing and range on a clipboard, adjusting calculations faster than any training manual would permit. Morton broke every rule. He attacked at periscope depth by day, surfaced at night to chase, and spoke to his men like a teacher, not a tyrant. His patrol logs read more like experiments than orders. When a torpedo missed, he logged why. When one struck true, he logged how. The boat became a moving classroom, a crucible where intuition met math. Onboard laughter returned, cautious but real, the kind that signaled confidence reborn from calculation. What they didn't yet know was that these improvisations would one day become official tactics taught fleet-wide. In Pearl Harbor's makeshift control center, walls once decorated with patriotic posters now displayed enemy shipping charts. Lines of red pins marked the arteries of Japanese supply, vital, vulnerable, and bleeding slowly. Commander Lockwood's staff began cross-referencing sinkings with intelligence intercepts, matching convoy schedules to submarine positions in a way no one had done before. "We're not hunters anymore," he said, tapping the chart. "We're surgeons." The shift in philosophy was quiet, but revolutionary. Each patrol became part of a greater design. Each captain's judgment a data point in a living experiment. The once chaotic undersea war was turning into a science of precision and timing. No one in Tokyo could yet see that the invisible tide was beginning to change direction. In the shipyards, torpedo tests continued under starlight. The Mark 14 finally detonated at proper depth after months of adjustment. A muted explosion in the bay, but a thunderclap in every engineer's heart. Crews gathered to watch, silent, the reflection of fire shimmering on the water like vindication. Commander Deke Parsons wrote the test results into his log with deliberate care, as though afraid they might vanish if written too quickly. Mechanics who had once been invisible to admirals were now spoken of by name in dispatches. Across the fleet, a sense of momentum returned. Reports from patrols began to show real tonnage sunk, not excuses. Each successful hit felt like a conversation answered after months of silence. The machines had finally learned to keep faith with the men who carried them. Training intensified, submariners practiced coordinated wolf pack formations, rehearsing radio silence drills, and shared attack timing. They built trust through repetition, one boat marking targets, another closing in, the third finishing what the first began. It required humility, precision, and absolute calm under pressure. Captains argued fiercely in briefings, but in those arguments, brilliance was born. Instructors no longer quoted textbooks. They quoted patrol logs, real battles, real decisions. The Pacific was becoming a proving ground not for ideology, but for adaptation itself. The hunted had begun to imitate the instincts of their predators, patience, stealth, and precision. The transformation was quiet, but the sea was already beginning to listen. By the spring of 1943, the tone across submarine bases had changed. The same officers who once returned home in silence now came back with evidence. Ships sunk, lessons learned, confidence restored. Morale rose not from speeches, but from competence. The Navy had become a school built on salt water and scars, and its graduates were growing more dangerous by the month. Engineers had turned failure into instruction. Captains had turned improvisation into discipline. The sound of torpedo tests no longer echoed frustration but progress. The Pacific, once a graveyard of lost chances, was now a classroom of hard-won mastery. Every mistake became a teacher, and the lessons came faster than anyone expected. The periscope glass of the USS Wahoo trembled as dawn painted the horizon, a thin orange, and Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton watched a Japanese freighter cut through calm seas like an answering pulse. Below him, the torpedo room readied a Mark 14, gyros checked, depth rings set by hand to a conservative 9 feet shy of the keel. Hands moved with the confidence of repetition, valves turned, firing handles tested, the click of safety latches sounding like a small benediction. Outside, the freighter's silhouette grew larger, the smoke from its stack trailing into a sky that felt suddenly intimate. Morton counted heartbeats and seconds the way a surgeon counts motions. He issued the order, breath held like everyone else on the conning tower. The torpedo left with a long silver hiss, a thin line of bubbles marking its descent through a green world. It struck amidships with a dull, vindicating roar that shook the hull of the freighter and the stomachs of the men watching below. For a moment there was only stunned silence, disbelief that such a simple thing as a proper depth and a reliable detonator could change everything. Then, slowly, the target began to tilt and take on water, a real visible consequence of years of stubborn correction. At Pearl Harbor, midnight oil still burned in a corrugated hangar where technicians from the Bureau of Ordnance gathered around a table strewn with exploded view drawings. Chief Technician Henry Bruckner had been awake for 48 hours, hands scored with metal filings, face rimmed with exhaustion and something cleaner, triumph. The test logs that had once read like accusations now showed patterns of correction, exploders rewired, depth mechanisms shimmed, gyros rebalanced to resist shock and sea currents. When the radio crackled with a field report from Morton's boat describing a clean detonation and adequate depth, the room erupted in quiet cheers that felt almost irreverent given the cost that had led them here. Engineers clasped one another's shoulders. Some wept without masking it, the relief of vindication stronger than the veneer of stoicism they'd practiced for months. They had been the scapegoats for too long, and tonight the machines that had betrayed them finally spoke true. The victory was small in the map of the Pacific, but enormous in the calculus of human will. What they didn't yet know was how contagious that success would become. A single reliable hit would teach tactics to an entire fleet. The change did not roar, It spread by example and by the quiet repetition of correct calculations. Word of successful torpedoes traveled faster than official dispatches, carried by returning captains, whispered in engine rooms, and scribbled on patrol reports that officers compared like trading cards. In forward bases, men who had learned patience as an art now felt the rush of vindication under their skins. Captain Richard O'Kane taped a small note in his log: proof of concept, depth corrected, detonation reliable. Such marginalia, once considered unprofessional, became the new currency of competence. Crews practiced firing solutions, adjusting speed and angle to exploit newly dependable detonators and more accurate depth settings. Wolfpack formations learned to trust that the first shot might open a hole rather than only scare a target. Confidence re-entered the bay like sunlight. Onboard radios carried coordinates and brief, excited reports. Instructors turned those reports into doctrine almost overnight. No one imagined that a handful of tweaks in a machine shop could rearrange battle plans across the ocean. The human response to working tools was immediate. Tactics became bolder, patrols more surgical, and captains more decisive. The Japanese convoy lanes felt the result before Admiralty hulls could mark it on charts. A tanker off Luzon rolled slowly and then disappeared beneath a sheen of oil, and the escorts could do little but watch flame lick the night. Lieutenant Masaru Fuji, scanning the dark, felt a new frigid knot of dread as a freighter he had assumed safe went down far too quickly for comfort. The pattern of survivable hits had been broken. The ocean now had a new habit, a precision it had not shown before. In Tokyo, reports of mysterious effective attacks reached staff officers who began to speak in tones edged with worry rather than certainty. Convoys tightened, routes changed, and naval planners debated whether to commit scarce destroyers to escort duty at the expense of projection. For Japan, the loss of each transport was not merely tonnage lost, it was fuel, rubber, and morale disappearing into the sea. The strategic calculus shifted as quietly as a tide, logistics became vulnerable, and the Empire's appetite for risk narrowed. What they didn't yet know was how rapidly a consistent pattern of losses could strangle operations far from battlefronts. Back in the labs, engineers refined detonators and rewired magnetic systems to be optional rather than mandatory, opting for contact exploders when magnetic fields proved fickle near certain steel hulls and varying latitudes. Chief inventor Deke Parsons insisted on redundant testing, deploying spare gyros and new depth sensors to absorb shock and temperature changes that had once wrecked accuracy. Submarine crews relearned how to trust meters and gauges. Periscope readings were double-checked against manual depth logs and versus the boat's own motion. The result was often a simple surgical calculus. Choose the right depth, set the correct gyro angle, and trust the wake you sent across the water. Launches started to feel less like prayers and more like controlled experiments. Boats returned with more than stories of near misses. They brought planktoned evidence of success and the quiet joy of competence. From shipyard benches to forward patrols, a new feedback loop formed. Test, adjust, patrol, report, refine. The force no longer fought each engagement as a single throw of fate. It fought as a learning organism, slowly refining the art of undersea warfare. On board the USS Tautog, a midwatch erupted into controlled mayhem when 3 torpedoes found a merchant in rapid succession. Men who had learned to count failures now counted proofs. The explosions came in a measured sequence: bow, midships, stern, and the freighter's list became a visible equation of success. Lieutenant Commander William Fenno watched from the control room as men who had been hollowed out, by frustrations smiled like cats in sunlight, small and private grins that each felt like personal transformation. The patrol log that night would be more than tally marks. It would be an argument for change, a documented refutation of months of defeat. When the boat surfaced hours later under a sky lit by stars and the glow of distant fires, the crew sang not because of celebration, but because they could again believe in the tools they carried. News of such patrols spread, and soon other captains emulated the firing solutions and depth choices used that night. The sea, fickle but obedient to correct physics, rewarded the patient and punished reckless faith. No one imagined that these sequences of hits would compile into a strategic advantage measurable in months, not just minutes. As Wolfpack tactics matured, multiple submarines coordinated attacks with timing that relied on reliable torpedoes and disciplined radio brevity. One boat marked, another closed, the third finished. Captain Morton's aggressive tactics found partners who trusted the first shot to count, allowing the second and third to exploit the chaos. Convoys once thought secure under the shadow of escort screens now found those screens peeled back and confused by synchronized strikes. The effect was not immediate theatrical victory but a steady erosion of supply lines. Merchant mariners disappeared. From manifests and ports recorded cargo shortfalls that rippled into factories and kitchens. Admirals noted tonnage statistics that once looked abstract and now felt very real, a slow, inexorable accounting that turned operational plans into desperate improvisations. The American fleet's new combination of mechanical reliability and coordinated aggression began to look less like luck and more like a systemic advantage. The hunters had learned to speak the ocean's language in a voice both precise and relentless. In the afterglow of that first true victory, engineers toasted with coffee in cold dawns, and captains wrote home with hands that trembled, not from fear but from conviction. Departments that had once traded blame for failure now traded blueprints and patrol notes with an efficiency that resembled devotion. The Pacific, which had swallowed so many confident plans, started to return favors in the form of predictable physics and repeatable results. Each sunk transport was a small bitter justice against months of denied expertise and lost lives, and each success tightened the thread of learning that bound sailors and engineers together. The war did not pivot in a single instant. It flexed and shifted, a muscle strengthened by repetition and resolve. For the first time steel answered steel, and the hunters felt the sea tremble. Flames hunched like wounded beasts along the flank of a tanker off Formosa. As the destroyer screens circled impotently, their searchlights cutting the smoke into thin, accusing blades, Lieutenant Hiroto Sakamura, standing on the bridge of an escort, watched the black slick spread across the water and felt a cold hollow grow beneath his ribs. The tanker's cargo, oil bound for industry, fuel for aircraft, warmth for distant homes, was turning the night into an inferno that reflected in every man's eyes. On board, signalmen tapped terse reports back to Tokyo, words clipped to fit cramped radio windows and clipped nerves. Back in a logistics office, clerk Mitsu Tanaka unfolded a manifest and crossed out a priority line. Rice shipments scheduled for Okinawa were simply not coming. The physical math of resource flow altered with each sunk hull, the tonnage gone translated into factories slowing, trains idling, and hospitals shorting fuel for sterilizers. Men who had believed in the sea as an artery of empire now measured losses in empty berths and silent cranes. The burn line on the horizon became a ledger entry that could not be erased. In that long, hot night, the war's abstract calculus collapsed into flaming, tangible consequence. What they didn't yet know was how many small absences would add up to strategic silence. In Tokyo's naval headquarters, a bank of radio operators replayed a stream of frantic calls, the static-strewn voices fraying like rope under strain. Admiral Keiji Mori paced beneath a map wall studded with pins, each pin now a question mark where a freighter once had been. Staff officers passed typed reports hand to hand, the paper edges smudged from constant handling, the red ink of corrections growing thicker by the hour. Convoy Fuji 12 reported sunk, escorts engaged, coordinates approximate, one message read, and the room inhaled around that small, devastating fact. The Admiral barked orders that tried to do what maps and doctrine had never been asked to do, patch holes in a logistics system while the whole thing was still moving. Below the room, dock foremen found themselves requisitioned for escort maintenance rather than loading, and cargo lists that had been carefully planned months earlier were torn up and rewritten at midnight. Entire production schedules shifted with the coldness of arithmetic. No ships, no materials, no output. Men in factories watched the evening tally like weather forecasts, each number meaning less heat, less metal, fewer bandages. The sense of pride that had girded the empire at the war's outset began to taste faintly of panic. No one imagined that the ledger of quiet losses would grow faster than the measures meant to stop it. On an island quay, widows and merchants stared at the manifest board, where names of incoming shipments had once been printed like promises. Mrs. Akemi Watanabe pressed her palm to the glass and traced the empty line where coal should have been, feeling the absence as if it were a hand squeezing her chest. Small businesses that had prospered on steady deliveries began to falter. Bakers measured flour with a new thrift and porters found themselves idle. Children learned to queue for hours for sugar that had once been simple to buy, a new patience settling over towns that had grown used to abundance. Each vanished ship was not only steel lost but a rearrangement of daily life. Fuel meant ambulances could not run, fertilizer meant fewer crops next season. In barracks and tea houses, men compared rumors of attacks like sailors comparing marks on a chart which lanes were safe, which were now traps. A merchant captain who had once laughed at the idea of being hunted began sleeping with boots at his bedside. The change was social as well as strategic. The war entered the grain of civilian existence. What they didn't yet know was how quickly this social ripple would become a national tide. Convoy commanders adjusted formations with the speed of men who had learned to improvise under pressure, tightening zigzag patterns and adding staggered sailings to confuse the now patient predators beneath the waves. Commander Eiichi Kubo ordered engines to vary speed by half-knot increments, and shifted escort spacing to create overlapping sonar arcs, hoping the geometry would deter stealthy approaches. The escorts did what doctrine had taught them: depth charge patterns, hedgehog barrages, aggressive counter-searches, but each maneuver consumed fuel and time and created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. Harbour masters reported escort wear and tear, and maintenance docks filled with screws and bearings that were once spare luxury items. The Japanese logistical machine, tuned for efficiency in peace and early war, now found itself cannibalizing its own lines just to keep the next convoy seaworthy. The calculus of risk grew personal in the watch officer's face each night. Men began to whisper about whether enough ships could be spared for both offense and the now demanding defense of supply chains. The tension between strategic want and logistical need became an argument whispered in corridors rather than shouted in war rooms. No one imagined that tightening the belt would not be enough to stop a persistent leak. At a forward signal station on Formosa, young radio operators tracked patterns of American submarine activity with a new clinical fear. They learned to count the pauses in radio silence like a new language. Sergeant Haruo Ishida plotted arcs where submarines had struck and could see with disturbing clarity, a widening corridor of vulnerability. Each successful attack taught the Americans something subtle about convoy timing, and each adaptation by escorts taught them to shift lanes, but always at the cost of fuel and patience. The island's docks filled with empty pallets and rusting cranes whose schedule of work was now an uncertain rumor. Local fishermen who once guided small coasters into safe coves now watched lifeboats instead, pulling bodies when they could, and marking the sea with crosses for the missing, when they could not. The human cost began to populate the maps of loss, not merely tonnage figures but faces, names, and the tiny economies of coastal towns. For planners back at the Admiralty, the data looked like a downward slope. For people on the shore, it looked like winter coming early. The logistics spreadsheet had become a list of people, and the people were beginning to matter more than abstract strategy. What they didn't yet know was that these human margins were where the war's outcome would be quietly decided. Inside a convoy's control cabin, the siren of an incoming distress call sent men into a practiced hush as they rerouted and peeled escorts off to investigate. Captain Toru Nakamoto watched through rain-streaked glass as rescue boats launched, and he thought about the next departure, whether this next convoy could be spared the same fate. The Admiralty's order to reorganize convoys arrived too late for many ports. Schedules already printed could not be rewritten without grounding critical operations. Factories that had geared up to meet a projected supply curve suddenly found themselves retooled, not for expansion but for conservation. Fuel rationing, repair prioritization, and a growing backlog of backlogged shipments. The invisible losses mounted, each sinking reverberating through supply chains, until even the most distant front felt the pinch. Naval intelligence updated maps and warnings, but warnings do not fill empty holds nor shorten long production waits. The Empire's reach began to feel brittle in new ways. Confidence cracked into anxious planning, and the edge of decision-making sharpened into caution. Men who had once expected the sea to deliver now refused to trust its fidelity. No one imagined that a series of quiet absences would rearrange entire theatres of operation. In a cramped wartime ministry office, bureaucrats argued over the painful arithmetic of replacement, how many tankers could be spared, what cargoes could be prioritized, and which islands would have to be deferred. Documents slid under signatures, like shells passed in a trench. Each approval felt like a small concession of power. Ministerial aides calculated rerouting costs in days and weeks, not in heroic strokes, and realized that time itself had become an enemy, as much as any submarine. Meanwhile in ports, dock workers cursed under breath as manifest lists shortened and schedules collapsed. Pensions and promises were now negotiated against the reality of fewer returning hulls. Families closed shutters, earlier shops stocked less. The rhythm of civilian life contracted in ways that would last long after the war. The political cost of each lost ship weighed on leaders whose legitimacy depended on perceived competence. Japan's strategic posture, aggressive and outward, had to absorb the inward shock of scarcity. The machinery of empire faltered in the small valves of supply, slow processes that could not be fixed by ships or bravado alone. What they didn't yet know was how permanent some of these shortages would become if the convoys could not be protected. By late 1943, the cumulative effect of invisible losses registered not as a single catastrophe, but as a steady, corrosive silence where ships should have been, and that silence made itself felt along every coastline and shelf of empire. Rear echelon officers counted tonnage in exhausted columns, and the numbers translated into ration cards, blackout curtains, and hospital wards that waited on pumps that might not be repaired. The Navy's hurried reorganization of convoys, though earnest, moved too slowly against an enemy that had learned to exploit patterns with patient ferocity. For the civilians who watched manifest boards and for the commanders who redrew routes by candlelight, the loss was not declared by a single headline but by the absence of the expected: a missing freighter, an empty berth, a factory that sputtered when a boiler could not be fueled. The scale of effect was quiet and brutal. It was algebra applied to human lives and found wanting. No gunfire announced their defeat. Only silence where ships should have been. The moon carved a silver path across an otherwise black sea, as three silhouettes rose in careful unison, periscopes and conning towers punctuating the night like distant sentinels. On the foredeck of the USS Wahoo, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush. Morton felt the salt-laced wind and listened for the soft metallic notes of other hulls surfacing nearby. Men moved without shout or flourish, a practiced choreography developed from hurried briefs and bitter lessons. Radio operators, faces lit by the glow of small instruments, keyed out encrypted bursts in 3-second windows, each transmission a tightly wrapped instruction meant to vanish into static as quickly as it came. The wolf pack did not roar, it whispered, then closed in with a machine, like inevitability. Hydrodynamic noise, ship wakes and breath on steel became the vocabulary of coordinated attack. Timing down to the half-minute mattered as much as gunnery. When the order finally came, torpedo tubes opened in staggered rhythm. A volley of steel threaded the water in a single lethal sequence. From the conning towers, men watched wakes converge on a single point and felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed with precision. In that moonlit moment, the ocean seemed less a passive highway and more a room filled by an orchestra they had learned to conduct. At a forward operations hut, Commander Charles Lockwood traced patrol geometries on a grease-stained chart, drawing overlapping arcs that turned isolated boats into a single hunting organism. He had argued for coordinated operations months before, and now the doctrine finally had instruments and trained crews to make it work. The idea was simple in concept and devilishly complex in execution. Share sightings, stagger intercepts, and time salvos, so escorts could not recover between blows. Captains like Eugene Fluckey and Richard O'Kane volunteered to lead packs, understanding that one measured strike could cascade into chaos for a convoy. Onboard men practiced signal brevity until messages became shorthand gestures. One light, one dash, and a whole maneuver shifted into place. Sonar men compared echo patterns, the way hunters once compared footprints in mud, translating sound into geometry and advantage. The mechanics of killing convoys became a study in economy. Expend torpedoes where they mattered, conserve where escorts threatened, and withdraw before the hunt turned on you. Victory was no longer a single bold stroke. It was an accumulation of precisely timed, interdependent acts. What they didn't yet know was how that precision would remap Japan's sea lanes into a landscape of persistent peril. On the bridge of the USS Tang, Executive Officer Richard O'Kane watched as a line of oil tankers heaved into view and relayed bearing and range to two partners shadowing from flanks. The first boat's role was masking, to draw escorts and thin their effectiveness. The second closed for the decisive angle. The third waited for confirmation and delivered the coup de grace. Each movement required absolute trust. A single mistimed radio burst could give away position and ruin the attack. Torpedoes were set with overlapping laid angles and slightly staggered depths to counter escorts' hedgehog patterns, a technical choreography born from months of labored trial. Below decks, torpedo crews worked like clockmakers, checking gyros and depth rings with the reverent focus of men handling instruments of fate. When the salvo struck, the effect was immediate. Explosions synchronized into a rolling collapse that unstitched the convoy's formation. Men on the conning tower felt a kind of awe as merchant hulls sheared and sank in a pattern that spoke of collective intent rather than lone heroics. The tactic was surgical, efficient, and most dangerous of all, repeatable. The sea had learned a new grammar, and men in 3 separate hulls were now fluent. In a Japanese escort's cramped plotting room, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanabe traced the wreckage report and tried to make sense of the new signature: multiple ships lost within minutes of each other, attacks hitting from different headings as if by coordinated ghosts. Admiralty cables forwarded inquiries with urgency. Tokyo ordered stricter convoy discipline and more destroyer escorts. But resources were finite and stretched across a widening front. Ports that once promised easy reinforcement now struggled to spare ships for protective duties without exposing other vital routes. Harbor cranes that loaded munitions and food stood idle longer, as escorts went out and returned battered and weary. The imperial logistic machine found itself making choices between offensive ambition and the blunt arithmetic of defense. Each decision carved away at capacity: fewer patrol planes, delayed convoys, and the steady attrition of stores that could not be replaced swiftly. Conjuring a defense against a moving, communicative predator proved harder than reinforcing static points. No one imagined that a few coordinated undersea units could force an adversary to rewrite entire logistical priorities. Back in the Wolfpack's forward plotting room, crews reviewed the night's tape recordings, annotating echo returns and escort responses like scholars annotating a rare manuscript. Sonar operators highlighted the moments when sonar pings overlapped and revealable returns blurred, teaching captains to exploit blind spots between sweeps. Engineers recommended slight modifications to launch timing to account for current shear and temperature gradients that altered torpedo runs by mere feet. Captains adapted on the fly, instructing helmsmen to hold speed to within a fraction of a knot and to keep course while periscope exposure was minimized. The human element, the quiet competence of watchstanders, and the calm decision-making of officers, fused with mechanical reliability to form a capability greater than its parts. Men learned to read silence as signal and to interpret faint mechanical coughs as instruments of fate. Training manuals began to change, absorbing those night transcripts into doctrine and then into muscle memory for future crews. The Wolfpack, once an experimental idea, now marched toward doctrine with the steady pace of institutionalization. What they didn't yet know was how quickly this disciplined craft would turn choke points into graveyards. On a moonlit night near the South China Sea, 3 submarines executed a textbook attack on a convoy hugging the coast. Merchantmen collided in confusion, trying to avoid both torpedoes and one another. Survivors later recalled harrowing scenes of ships breaking apart, lifeboats overturned, and the ocean turning black with oil and bodies on the decks of the attacking boats. Men watched through wet eyes and squinted against the spray, feeling the gravity of their work as much as the thrill. The coordinated strike produced results measured in tons, and in the sudden, brutal silence that followed when radios fell still and the escorts began to sound desperate searches, headquarters recorded the sinkings as tactical victories and strategic blows, adjusting campaign priorities accordingly. Battle reports praised the discipline and timing, and orders soon sent more packs to high-traffic lanes. The pattern was becoming self-reinforcing. Success led to doctrine. Doctrine led to more success, and success reshaped maritime geography. The hunters had learned to multiply themselves, turning isolated bravery into collective, repeatable force. The sea itself, once the stage, now acted as ally, its physics obeyed by men who had mastered its laws. Word of the wolf packs reached Tokyo's naval analysts and forced a change in tone. What had once been dismissed as luck now required methodical counter-strategy. Admiral staffers convened long nights poring over engagement records, trying to identify the signature of coordinated attacks and to anticipate where the next would fall. They experimented with convoy dispersion, air cover layering, and the use of decoy ships to confuse wolfpack targeting, but each measure demanded fuel and aircraft that were already in short supply. Ports that once operated like clockwork now had timetables that shifted with alarming unpredictability. The Empire's strategic options narrowed as escorts and fighters were siphoned to defense, reducing offensive reach and compounding logistical strain. Men ashore pinched supplies and ration lines lengthened. The economic ripples of each sinking reached far inland into factory floors and hospital wards. The Japanese search for a response highlighted the brutal arithmetic of modern naval war. Resources spent protecting supply lines were resources not spent projecting power. No one imagined that a handful of stealthy boats working in careful concert could so effectively bend the arc of maritime strategy. When dawn finally came after another night of coordinated strikes, survivors clambered aboard coastwise vessels and told of a dark, precise choreography that had left little time for rescue. Crews on the attacking submarines cleaned gear with practiced hands and logged the patrol details with the weary equilibrium of men who had watched consequence unfold and now catalogued it. Back at headquarters, charts filled with red marks showing where wolf packs had struck, and fleets began to be rerouted with an urgency that smelled of defeat, avoided but not prevented. The Pacific had become a theatre where coordination, patience, and mechanical faith produced an advantage that could not be undone by bravado alone. Supply lines, the invisible circulatory system of empire, had been exposed as fragile, and the balance of initiative had shifted toward those who had learned to speak the ocean's language together. They no longer stalked alone. The ocean itself had learned to hunt. The rooms smelled of ink, sweat, and the faint metallic odor of wet maps. Admirals in dark uniforms stood motionless as a young lieutenant dropped a fresh casualty report onto the lacquered table. Admiral Keiji Mori reached out and placed his palm over the paper as if to still the numbers. Flickering lamp cast long shadows across rows of statistics that began with routine logistics and ended in sudden absence. Around the map, men repeated figures aloud: tonnage lost, escorts sunk, estimated days of fuel in reserve, voices pared thin by disbelief. Outside the veranda, the steady slap of waves against the quay carried a sound that felt like counting. The Admiral traced a coastline with a finger, pausing where a new pin would soon mark another vanished transport. "How many more?" someone asked. The question small in a room made for decisive orders. Papers shuffled. A map marker rolled across a chart and settled with a soft accusing click. For the first time, the room felt like a tribunal where policy and consequence met in exhausted silence. A junior officer spoke up with a list of routes that had become nightmares rather than arteries. He described night after night of ships going dark, of tankers failing to reach refineries, and of convoys that never returned. Messages had to be sent in truncated form to save airwaves, and every omission grew like a scar on planning maps. Admiral Sato read aloud intercepted reports that hinted at coordinated undersea tactics, and felt a knot of cold tighten behind his ribs. He barked for explanations, for redeployment, for more destroyers, but the charts showed too many theaters and too few hulls to move. Clerks in the corner consulted timetables and realized that manufacturing output lagged behind consumption in critical materials. A fatigue-lined logistics officer whispered that Tokyo's reserves were no longer a strategic cushion, but a dwindling account. What they didn't yet know was that these losses would not be recovered by simple redistribution. The pattern had teeth. A young admiral slid a photograph across the table of a burnt tanker, its bow sunk, and its crew scattered like notes on the sea. The image made the numbers human, and the room, for the first time, began to consider the social cost of supply failure. In a smaller office, Rear Admiral Hideo Tanaka replayed a tape of reports from forward station chiefs. Each clipped transmission sounded like a metronome counting out the Empire's shrinking options. He called for immediate re-evaluation of convoy doctrine and proposed new escort allocations that would strip other commands bare. Staff officers argued about priorities, whether to reinforce the Philippines or to secure shipping lanes to the home islands, and the debate grew heated. The Admiral's finger hovered over a list of tankers and transports and then fell away as he realized there were simply not enough hulls to cover every need. He ordered satellite-like coordination between naval and civilian ministries so that rationing and naval movements could be synchronized. Communications officers worked furiously to reroute messages while maintaining radio discipline to avoid giving submarines any clue. In the ports, dockmasters received hurried notices that convoys would be delayed and crews stood down without certainty of new orders. Families waiting for goods in coastal towns learned impatience and fear as normal conditions. The operational imperative to keep the Navy supplied began to compete with the political imperative of homeland morale. Word of the mounting crisis seeped into the streets, where tea shops fell silent and storefronts began to trim. Merchants who had once planned seasonal shipments now hoarded supplies and bartered in hushed tones. In a makeshift war cabinet, ministers argued that public panic must be avoided even as ration lists lengthened. Admiral Maury sent delegates to inspect convoys personally, and their reports painted a picture of escorts exhausted and crews frayed. A single inspector's notebook listed maintenance backlogs, hull fatigue, and the grinding wear of escort engines that had been running at high tempo for months. He circled a particular corridor where losses concentrated and recommended alternative routing that would cost more fuel and time than planners could afford. The Minister of Transport balked at the expense, and the meeting dissolved into procedural paralysis that felt like a slow withdrawal. What they didn't yet know was that each delayed decision hardened into a vulnerability that would be exploited without mercy. Back at Admiralty, conversations shifted from blame to contingency planning. They now sketched supply priorities in pencil rather than ink. Outside the palace walls, the ocean continued its patient work of erasing schedules like footprints on a shore. In the dark of night, a convoy huddled under a curtain of stars, unaware that its rhythm had been mapped and studied for weeks. The escorts performed drills that had become routine, patterns of search and flank sweeps practiced until reaction was second nature. Commander Arichi Kubo watched radar flicker in fits and starts, and when the sonar returned only faint, ambiguous echoes, he knew the danger had entered a new phase. A single torpedo slammed into a cargo hold with a muted thunder that felt disproportionate to its size and left men reeling in shock. Lifeboats were launched in confusion as the convoy attempted to regroup. survivors clinging to bits of timber and hope. The rescue efforts revealed another painful truth. Many trained hands were already tied up keeping other lines alive, so response times lagged. Dispatches to Tokyo emphasized immediacy, but the capital's answers were constrained by long-term shortages and stretched shipyards. The material reality of war, rails, ports, shipyards, became a geography of constraint that limited the Admiralty's options. Commanders at sea were now making choices based on immediate survivability rather than broader operational ambition. The once confident calculus that had planned empire-wide operations shifted to the hard arithmetic of triage. News of another heavy loss reached the imperial palace at dawn, and the emperor's aides whispered in hallways, not meant for arguments. Ministers convened urgent councils where maps were annotated with red ink and with the weary strokes of men who had seen too much. Admiral Sato delivered a blunt assessment. Unless convoy protection could be materially increased within weeks, frontline units would begin to feel shortages. The room went quiet, and for a moment the scale of consequence, not tactical but existential, settled over the assembled men. Military governors in outlying prefectures sent telegrams listing their most urgent needs, and civil administrators replied with apologies and promises that sounded hollow. The Minister of Munitions proposed diverting industrial capacity to produce more escorts, but that would sap offensive shipbuilding already underway. Economists produced grim forecasts showing months in which consumption would outstrip replacement tonnage by a factor that could not be remedied. What they didn't yet know was how public patience would fray under repeated shortages, pressuring leaders toward riskier decisions. The Admiralty had to choose between holding on to offensive plans and saving the fragile supply lines that kept the home islands fed. In that calculus, the sea's silent attrition had become a force-shaping state policy rather than merely a naval tactical problem. In a coastal village, mothers rationed rice and hid extra portions, turning scarcity into a new domestic ritual. Port chaplains recorded funerals for merchant mariners with a cadence that had once been reserved for battlefield deaths. Newsreels back in Tokyo spoke of bravery and resilience, while the reality of empty docks and idle cranes told a different story. The Navy tried public relations, releasing edited accounts of engagements meant to reassure, but families compared those stories to manifest lists and found gaps. Recruiting posters hung heavier in winter air, the slogans feeling brittle. Now, when compared to long lines at ration offices, parliamentarians questioned the pace of escort production and the cost-benefit of expanding convoy protection versus continuing offensive operations. The political center of gravity shifted subtly as opposition voices argued for prioritizing homeland survival over expansionist ambition. Ministers and admirals now spoke in the same room more often, each meeting an attempt to reconcile military necessity with civilian endurance. The cost of flexibility had become painfully clear. Every ship diverted to shielding convoys was a ship unavailable for grand operations. The Empire's proud outward reach began to appear as brittle as the supply chains that sustained it. By the winter of 1944, casualty charts no longer shocked as numbers but haunted as absence. Empty spaces where once there had been certainty. Admirals stared at the maps and understood that the pattern was neither random nor temporary, but a sustained campaign that struck at the Empire's veins. Strategic meetings shifted from confident directives to grim triage, with priorities ordered in penciled columns and reluctant compromises. Ships once designated for offense were reassigned for protection, and entire operations were postponed as the Navy tried to keep supply lines from collapsing. Sailors and merchant crews who had once sailed with a sense of destiny now crossed the horizon with a quiet prayer and the resignation of those who understood risk. In quiet moments, commanders confessed that their greatest battles were no longer fought on charts but in shipyards and factory floors. The sea had taught a cruel lesson. What could not be seen could not be engaged in the traditional manner of fleet battle. What they didn't yet know was how permanent that lesson would prove to be, reshaping not only naval tactics but the fate of nations. In the end, the Admiralty discovered an uncomfortable truth. Strategic power depended as much on the preservation of supply as on the boldness of fleets. What they could not see, they could not fight, and by then the sea belonged to ghosts. The destroyer's hull slammed through night swells as lookouts strained toward the horizon for any sign of disturbance, while below, sonar pings stitched the dark into rough maps. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanabe watched needle swings and ordered a pattern change when the return jittered. A small act of ritual now, a practiced dance against something unseen. Depth charges were set with mechanical precision, fuse timed to explode at 30, 40, then 60 fathoms, each blast sending a shock wave that rattled ribs and welded men together with shared effort. On the bridge, officers chewed the ragged edge of exhaustion but kept their faces hard because the men below expected no less. The first run left only bubbling oil and a sheen on the water. The second run scattered plankton and sea spray like confetti. Men in the wardroom swapped worried glances because the sound that failed to produce a kill produced a new, more dangerous certainty. The enemy was learning, changing tactics, and often slipping away. Elsewhere, a battered submarine I-37 crawled toward home with a leaking ballast tank and a hull groaning under the strain of repeated depth attacks. Its captain, Lieutenant Masaru Saito, kept silence until the engineering officer muttered that pumps were failing and welds had been pressed to the limit. The men cleaned burns on their hands and the salt from their eyes and tried to make bravery look like routine. Outside, the fog rolled in like a curtain and the sea swallowed both sound and resolve. At the naval arsenal, engineers bent over blueprints for new sonar arrays and anti-submarine mortars, sketching improvements into margins where there had been certainty. They argued about frequency bands that might pierce American stealth, and about whether to adapt ADSIC readings to local thermocline quirks. Chief Technician Sakurai warned that producing sophisticated gear would strain already overstressed factories and divert resources from ship repair. Admirals replied that necessity justified redirection, but the paperwork moved slower than sinking oil tankers. Dock workers who rewelded hull plates had to choose between patching an escort and finishing a merchant that would carry flour to starving towns. The arithmetic of wartime production turned technical debates into moral ones. Every new anti-subrefice device meant fewer boots for island fortifications or fewer rails for munitions. Men on the production line felt the tug of patriotism and pragmatism pulling at once. What they didn't yet know was whether new gadgets could outrun the strategic damage already done. In the quiet of the machine halls, the clatter of presses sounded almost like counting down. In a forward radio room, 100 miles from the home islands, signals came in clipped and urgent, as escorts reported another night of evasions that left only oil and overturned life rafts. Commander Eiichi Kubo gathered junior officers and inked revised convoy timetables onto grease-stained charts, his hand steady but his voice thin with fatigue. They tried reroutes, daylight transits, and the hurried drafting of decoy convoys trading off speed for perceived safety. The men who loaded the ships had to be recalled, and schedules that once had confident rhythm now stuttered with ad hoc changes. Port authorities complained that harbor capacity was being used to patch escorts rather than to service the merchant fleet. Merchants argued that without protected runs their businesses died. In the towns, shopkeepers looked at new manifest lists and made plans to reduce stock. Ration offices rehearsed longer queues. The small economic shocks multiplied into local crises, and governors began to send plaintive cables about hospitals that could not sterilize instruments without fuel. The tactical fight at sea had become a bureaucratic problem ashore, and each failed intercept translated into a letter stamped urgent. No one imagined that a trickle of missed deliveries could so quickly become a current of social strain. On the deck of a destroyer, bells clanged as depth charges were readied again, and sailors braced while the ship pitched and rolled like a beast in pain. Petty Officer Yamamoto strapped himself in and listened to the engines strain as speed increased to hold a search pattern. The explosions came, and the ocean answered with a chorus of creaks and groans that made men look at one another with the sort of worry usually reserved for storms. Below decks, damage control teams practiced their choreography, a choreography of sealing, patching, and praying that rivets held. The repeated effort to repel invisible hunters left hulls stretched and parts worn. Spares were consumed faster than yards could produce them. When a sub finally surfaced damaged and limping, the sailors who had trained to hate the enemy now treated survivors with a mixture of pity and the uneasy respect reserved for kindred sufferers. They passed water and bandages. They spoke quietly about family and food, and whether the next patrol might be their last. The sea's harsh lessons had begun to shape a different kind of camaraderie between hunted and hunter, between those who survived and those who had to keep going. What they didn't yet know was how deep the well of human cost would be. A hospital ship moored in a quiet cove took in men with burnt hands and cracked ribs, and the surgeons kept meticulous lists of injuries that were not always battle wounds, but the cumulative result of strain. Nurses moved like soft ghosts through narrow wards, dabbing at fevered brows and stitching wounds while the men spoke in low voices about deserts they had never seen. Captain Taro Nishimura, returning from a failed patrol, watched a young seaman stare at a photograph of a child and realized the weight of absence on every face. Families received word of lost vessels on thin, official forms that did nothing to match the grief or the practical vacuum left behind. The social net strained. Widows petitioned for pensions that were delayed by bureaucratic load and the shifting priorities of a nation at war. In factories, absenteeism grew as workers were called away for naval repair work or conscripted for emergency runs. Civilians who had once believed in the inevitability of victory now whispered about how long their supplies might last. The human ledger filled with names and small tragedies as the conflict shifted from abstract strategy to daily survival. Many began to ask whether the costs borne at sea were being translated into real gains somewhere else. Back at the Admiralty, memoranda circulated proposing more aggressive hunter-killer groups to chase American subs rather than only defend convoys, but ship counts were insufficient to staff such forces. Admiral Keiji Mori weighed the plan on a map and saw the true problem to hunt effectively. You must leave lanes unguarded, and to defend everything was to defend nothing. Well, he ordered a cautious program of hunter-killer taskings, borrowing planes from coastal commands and assigning a handful of corvettes for patrol, but the program was starved at birth by fuel shortages and maintenance backlogs. Crews sent out on those missions spoke of long days without relief and nights when mechanical failure made their ships nearly as dangerous as enemies. Each abortive hunt consumed more repair time and left the next convoy thinner. The The strategic elasticity of the Navy was shrinking, and every attempt at remedy seemed only to rearrange scarcity. In the quiet of his cabin, the Admiral contemplated the arithmetic. Every ship moved to the hunt meant fewer cargoes delivered, and fewer cargoes meant factories idle. What they didn't yet know was whether bold hunting could reverse an attrition that had already reached deep into the fabric of society. In a fisheries village outside Nagasaki, fishermen who once guided coastal freighters now hauled in nets with fewer hands and less fuel, their lives rearranged by decisions in far-off rooms. They told stories of a submarine's wake like sailors telling of sea monsters, but the anecdotes had a tone of weary acceptance rather than mythic fear. Men who had once been indifferent to the Navy's grand strategy found themselves measuring strategy in sacks of rice and barrels of oil. Towns developed unofficial networks to redistribute scarce goods, neighbors becoming supply points in an informal economy of survival. The moral question of the war, what was worth sacrificing for projected glory, began to be asked in tea-houses and at market stalls. Clergy found congregations that wondered aloud whether the honor of distant campaigns justified the hunger under their roofs. These quiet civilian reckonings had political life. Ministers heard them and had to attend to the whispers growing into complaints. The home front had become a second battlefield, governed by taste and need rather than maps and flags. No one imagined that the moral weight of supply shortages would one day shape post-war conversations about choices and responsibility. When a battered submarine finally slipped through harbor mists and tied up at its pier, men who had survived sat on crates and smoked in horrible silence, aware that they had borne more than metal scars. Lieutenant Masaru Saito walked slowly along the deck and felt the salt in his boots like a memory of everything that had been lost and everything that remained. Mechanics began the long, methodical work of repair, while officers compiled patrol reports that read like confessions and testimony. The Admiralty promised new measures and mobilized what resources it could, but the scale of loss had outpaced the muscle of the war machine. The moral calculus had shifted. Victory now required not only courage but the capacity to preserve the means of war, hulls, fuel, and the fragile lives sustained by them. In small rooms and large docks, men counted not only tonnage but faces and futures, and the arithmetic often ended in a quiet, terrible subtraction. Even the bravest crews could not fight shadows that learned faster than men. The bunkroom hummed with diesel and quiet hands as young submariners folded thin paper into envelopes by lamplight. Petty Officer James Caldwell chewed the end of his pencil and wrote a single, spare line to his wife about the weather back home and the child he had not yet met. Around him, others sealed letters with wax or tucked photographs between pages, the ritual small and enormous at once. Above, the diesel engines idled like sleeping beasts, their vibration a constant reminder of the metal coffin they inhabited. Men clipped their dog tags to the paper as if fastening a talisman to a prayer. The captain moved between bunks checking torpedo lockers, and then paused to sign for the mail himself, an act that felt like blessing before departure. No one spoke above a whisper because silence had a value now beyond decorum. It was insurance against panic. They filed out into the night with envelopes in their pockets, eyes adjusted to moonlight and minds rehearsing angles and depths. On the quay, a crane swung slowly and the smell of cold sea came up in heavy gusts that filled lungs with salt and the taste of home. For many, those letters were the only tangible proof they might return to the ordinary world they had left behind. The water boiled where a merchant had gone down, corkscrews of black oil and flotsam spinning in the troughs. Survivors clung to broken beams and overturned lifeboats, faces white with shock and salt as waves rocked them like small graves. Lieutenant Kenji Arai of a Japanese escort hauled a soaked man aboard and felt the stranger's fingers close around his coat like a confession. The rescue boat's engine coughed, and they pulled bodies that still breathed and bodies that did not, sorting miracles from the dead with hands that trembled. On the deck of an American sub, sailors watched helpless through rain-streaked periscopes, obedient to orders that forbade surfacing unless safe. The commander's voice was tight as he radioed coordinates to rescue craft, constrained by strategy even as compassion demanded more. In a nearby fishing launch, an old man with knotted hands tied a rope and leaned over the rail until his shoulders ached, knowing each pull might mean life. A boy on a distant shore learned how the sea could take a father's voice and leave only clothing to point accusingly at the horizon. For hours they pulled and sorted, wrapped and numbered, mouths issuing names into night that may have been mistaken or true. When the work ended and the lights dimmed, the survivors counted breaths and found that grief had become their most accurate instrument. On the American side, commanders recorded these rescues in logbooks between tactical notes and engine readings, their handwriting a mix of duty and dawning sorrow. Commander William Fenno scrubbed a blot of oil from his sleeve and noted the survivors' accounts with a rigid professionalism that barely masked his empathy. They spoke of merchant seamen who had fought to the end and of young gunners who simply were not prepared for the terrible speed of modern killing. In Japanese ports, families gathered to wait for notice, and officers posted lists in docks where every name carried weight and fear. Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura waited against a railing and watched the harbor lights like a dumb prayer, reading manifest lists for hope and finding empty spaces where ships should have been. The theater of war was beginning to make ordinary private life its ledger, and people learned to measure time in return voyages and ration coupons. What they didn't yet know was how widespread these private catastrophes would be, how the sum of small losses would reshape nations and everyday life. Each letter returned unread or each name missing on a roster became a small erosion of morale that did not show up on grand charts. Commanders began to speak softly of endurance rather than triumph, of preserving what remained rather than seizing what was lost. In quiet, men on both sides started to consider survival as a duty equal to victory. A Japanese submarine captain, Lieutenant Masaru Saito, sat alone in the wardroom and traced the photograph of his son with a thumb that trembled slightly. He had ordered depth charge evasion drills until dawn and seen his boat oiled and patched in hurried docks, and yet the face in the photograph was a country he might never return to. His officers contrasted doctrine with the reality of broken rivets and failing pumps, arguing about whether to risk a patrol that might yield supplies or certain loss. The men below decks spoke in low tones of rice sacks and candy sent home when times were easier, memories that felt like contraband in a war of attrition. Across the Pacific, an American boatswain, Samuel Ortiz, polished a medal he did not wear much because medals had begun to feel like scattered lint against the scale of loss. He thought of nights when he had seen enemy sailors flounder and had turned away because command forbade the risk, and that thought settled in his gut like a stone. Both crews learned a brutal lesson. The ethics of war are not abstract when a man calls your name from a piece of timber. The operational necessity of mission accomplishment sometimes outweighed immediate rescue, and men made those choices while their hands still trembled from the sea. No one imagined such choices would echo in memory as moral scars long after metal returned to docks and hulls were repaired. The human toll did not vanish when battles expired. It lay layered beneath uniforms, and uniforms would not tell the full story. In field hospitals under tarps, and in permanent wards. Surgeons worked in the bright antiseptic light to mend men who would never again be what they were before the sea took them. Nurses like Aya Takahashi moved with practiced calm, dabbing saline, stitching lacerations, and offering words that sounded both professional and heartbreakingly small. Men with missing limbs practiced balance and speech, and learned to make jokes that masked terror and pain, a brittle humor that kept sleep at bay. Chaplains walked the corridors with small books and quieter hands, helping men confess things that had no place in official reports. A young American petty officer, Lee Bradford, wrote a letter to his sister about the coughing of a dying enemy sailor, and wondered how to make his words honest without making them unbearable. Military hospitals kept meticulous records, but those ledgers could not measure the nights when sailors dreamed of oil-slicked waters and woke gasping with the taste of salt. Families back home received telegrams that arrived like cold shutters, and communities gathered to share grief in a way that was as practical as it was mournful. Relief committees organized tea distributions and small comfort parcels, gestures that were logistical and intimately human at once. The shared suffering created slender threads across oceans. Men who had once been strangers now shared names, wounds, and funerals linked by sea and fate. In these wards, the war's statistics began to feel less like numbers and more like the testimony of lived loss. Onshore, factory foremen recalculated labor after lists of casualties and convalescents arrived in the morning pigeonholes, adjusting output and worrying about deadlines. The absence of skilled hands meant slower repair schedules for hulls and fewer engines available for patrols, and those delays fed directly back into operational risk. Admiral Lockwood received reports of reduced sortie rates and folded them into broader operational planning, understanding that the human toll had immediate strategic consequence. War rooms began to map not only enemy movements but the availability of men and the timeline of recovery. Mortality and morbidity entered tactical equations. In quiet study, historians later would point to these supply-side human factors as decisive in ways guns and bombs alone could not explain. The living memory of sailors' small sufferings translated into changed doctrine, more rest cycles, different patrol lengths, and an emphasis on rescue when possible. Commanders started asking different questions. How many men can be spared for search and rescue without imperiling a mission? And what is the true cost-benefit in lives? Those questions had answers that were never purely numerical, and men had to make decisions that no manual had prepared them for. Both navies learned that the human sea was as much a force to be managed as tide charts and sonar pings. As policy followed experience, the personal losses of sailors shaped strategies in ways that would outlast any single campaign. Decades after the war, survivors gathered under grey skies to remember, hands weathered and eyes bright, with the effort of recalling what had happened beneath the waves. Captain O'Kane would read from his old logs and point out entries where simple human choices had made the difference between life and death. Veterans compared scars like maps, each line telling of a day at sea, a depth charge, or a rescue that nearly failed. They told stories not of glory but of borrowed courage and the small mercies of comrades who shared rations and blankets in storms. Communities built memorials of stone and rusted propellers, places where families left coins and children learned names of those who had not returned. Historians and poets would later debate whether memory softened or sharpened truth, but the survivors knew the truth as a sequence of nights and ships and breaths. The acts of writing letters before patrols, of pulling bodies from the water, of patching a hull at dawn became ritual testimony, proof that men had been there. These rituals shaped post-war life. Charities were founded, pensions fought for, and local histories written with care. The human cost became a social ledger that demanded recognition and recompense, and nations slowly learned that the price of war extended far beyond borders. In each reunion and each memorial, the sea's impartial appetite for life and memory was acknowledged with quiet, persistent sorrow. In the end, the human stories threaded through strategy, turning operational decisions into personal fate and back again. Men who had once measured success in tonnage and sinkings began to judge it by the number of letters delivered and the faces returned home. Commanders balanced risk with mercy, sometimes choosing rescue over aggression and sometimes choosing otherwise, each choice etched into the conscience of those who made it. The shared suffering blurred national lines. A sailor on a raft recognized in the eyes of an enemy survivor the same fear and the same stubborn will to live. The war's strategic arcs were written on the backs of individual losses, and those losses influenced production, doctrine, and diplomacy in measurable ways. Decades later, families would read old letters and realize how thin the thread had been between survival and oblivion, and how small acts could tilt the ledger toward life. The ocean kept its silence, indifferent to politics, indifferent to banners. Its surface mirrored sunrise and storm with equal clarity. They had fought with steel and with courage, but what remained most human were the small private acts, like sealing a letter or pulling a drowning man into light. In the calculus of history, these were not footnotes but primary lines of consequence that would shape nations' choices for years to come. They all breathed the same salt air and sank beneath the same indifferent waves. A crane stood idle at Yokohama, its hook swinging slowly in a wind that carried the tang of salt and something like neglect, while a line of empty berths stretched into grey water. Dockman Ichiro Matsuda walked the wharf counting slips of paper where manifest lists once promised timber, coal, and canned goods. Now his pencil hovered over blanks. The harbour's electric winches, designed to lift 20 tons with steady ease, lay quiet, bearings stiff from lack of use and grease. Long since gone gummy, trucks that had carried crates of rubber and machinery idled with flat tires, mechanics waiting for parts that would not arrive. Inside the Ministry of Transport, analysts compared Allied shipping intelligence with their own logs and found corridors that used to pulse with trade, now reduced to near zero. Port lights burned at half-mast to conserve fuel, and night shifts shortened as foremen sent men home earlier to save rations. The physical infrastructure of an empire is not only steel and rope, but the rhythm of constant movement. When that rhythm stops, the machinery of nationhood splutters. People who had believed in uninterrupted supply began to learn how the absence of movement could dismantle not just a fleet, but a society. The quay's silence had a sound all its own, the long, slow exhale of an empire losing its breath. Across the ocean, Commander Charles Lockwood read Allied shipping reports with a clinical satisfaction that was tempered by awareness of human consequence. Charts mapped lanes where Japanese trade had once been regular, now showing gaps marked in red. The data spoke a simple truth: tonnage denied is production denied. Lockwood briefed admirals on interdiction efficiency, citing average sinkings per patrol and tonnage reductions that translated directly into fewer trains running and fewer factories turning for planners. These were neat columns of cause and effect. Fewer merchant voyages equaled less raw material reaching mills, which meant less ammunition, fewer tires, and eventually less fuel for warplanes. The benefit was strategic and the arithmetic elegant. The moral price, he knew, would be paid on distant streets and in quiet homes. Intelligence officers quantified the blockade's impact in weeks until shortages would bite and tried to estimate where civilian morale might fray first. Those calculations were clinical, but they fed operational decisions that would intensify pressure on Japan's capacity to wage war. In that same moment, thousands of nameless citizens began to change their shopping and eating habits without understanding the statistics that had made them necessary. The blockade was not just a naval success, it was a fiscal and social engine of decline. On the docks, mothers queued for hours under a low winter sun to receive rationed rice while their children clung to sleeves and asked aloud for sweets no longer on the list. Mrs. Keiko Yamada counted the meager portions into bowls and felt the geometry of scarcity shape her family's week. Flour, that once arrived monthly, now trickled in small, uncertain shipments. Small factories that produced bicycle parts and canned fish cut shifts and furloughed hands, and men who had been skilled machinists found themselves idle and ashamed. The island prefectures felt the strangulation first. Fuel shortages meant fewer ferries, and remote clinics waited longer for anesthetic and sutures. The social cost of tonnage loss crept into hospitals and schools, where absenteeism rose and overtime became impossible. Local officials sent desperate telegrams to Tokyo, pleading for prioritization that often did not come because national planners faced impossible trade-offs. The human geography of decline looked nothing like a battlefield map. It resembled a web of dependencies slowly severed one by one. What they didn't yet know was how many institutions would fail to recover fully once the chokehold had been applied. In a factory office, foreman Takeshi Ono scribbled production forecasts that read like obituaries for planned projects. Shift reduced, engines delayed, deadlines slipped. He calculated material shortfalls down to the last bolt and tried to reallocate scarce steel to the most essential lines, a painful game of prioritization. Machine shops that once turned out precise propeller shafts now bent to repair jobs, rivets, plates, and hull braces, consuming time that new construction could not afford. Naval dockyards reported that repair cycles had grown from weeks to months, because spares that used to arrive from merchant convoys no longer did. The operational tempo of shipyards slowed, and the Navy felt the effect as a lag in the number of escorts available for convoy duty. Admirals confronted a choice where every option had a deadly cost: conserve remaining ships for homeland defense or risk them in distant operations that might revive offensive plans. The strategic center of gravity shifted inward, and the Empire's outward reach contracted to protect what little remained. No one imagined this steady attrition would so swiftly translate from statistical loss to operational impotence. On the American side, patrol reports and decoded intercepts confirmed the effectiveness of sustained submarine campaigns and encouraged tighter coordination with carrier-based strikes and aerial mining. Admirals used these confirmations to press for intensified interdiction in choke points like the South China Sea, knowing that each mined harbor and sunken tanker multiplied the blockade's effect. Logistics teams planned follow-on operations that would not only sink ships but prevent repair and salvage by keeping pressure on ports and shipyards. Meanwhile, political leaders calculated the wider geopolitical endgame. An economy choked at sea could not support far-flung garrisons nor rebuild a shattered fleet. For planners in Washington, the maritime campaign was an instrument of national strategy, a way to reduce enemy capacity without necessarily inflicting the immediate cost of amphibious invasion. The calculation was cold but pragmatic. Reduce the enemy's ability to sustain war, and the political will to continue will follow. That logic guided resource allocation across theaters and shaped bombing priorities to include targets that would compound shipping shortfalls. The blockade's success was not accidental. It was the result of cumulative learning. adaptation, and the disciplined application of naval power to a specific economic vulnerability. In Tokyo's markets, the mood hardened as ration cards became instruments of daily life, and people learned the ritual of waiting without complaint. Storekeepers locked their shutters earlier, children grew used to stale bread and shorter baths. The social fabric stretched thin as communities established informal exchange networks to smooth supply unevenness. Neighbors swapping sugar for oil or offering rides to those who could not reach distant depots. Local councils reorganized to prioritize schools and hospitals on the allocation lists, and priests held ceremonies to mark the endurance of communities. But endurance has a limit, and the psychological effect of chronic shortage was as corrosive as any bomb. Officials reported increasing instances of theft and black market activity, the natural entropy of scarcity under strain. Political pressure mounted as regional leaders demanded protection and supplies, and national authorities struggled to maintain both military effort and civil order. What they didn't yet know was how these stresses would shape post-war politics and popular sentiment in the long years that would follow the conflict. Everyday choices about what to feed a child or which boiler to repair accumulated like the small strokes of a nation's portrait of survival. At sea, Japanese convoys grew smaller and ever more precious, their sailing scheduled with careful calculus that weighed risk against necessity. A single lost tanker could delay an offensive for months. Captains who once trusted doctrine now relied on intelligence, evasive routing, and the hope that weather could be an ally. Yet weather was fickle and provided only occasional shelter from the systematic interdiction that had become the Allies' quiet strategy. Destroyer captains, strained from constant escort duty, learned to value stealth in addition to aggression, conserving fuel and crew to make it to the next convoy, rather than chase elusive contacts. The result was a strategic contraction. The Navy could no longer project power freely, and instead consumed itself protecting what little it had left. In conversations among commanders, talk turned from plans of conquest to plans of preservation. Ideas once considered embarrassing, like negotiated shortages and territorial compromise, began to appear pragmatic. The imperial narrative of inexorable expansion gave way to a more somber calculus of survival and triage. The collapse had not arrived with a single thunderclap, but marched in measured steps, each sunk ship shortening the list of possible futures. When the cold season arrived and cranes at the main docks creaked like old men, the nation felt the cumulative effect in every household, and in the hollowed spaces of once busy yards, men like Ichiro Matsuda walked home through streets where shop signs were faded and awnings sagged, carrying the small victory of another ration allotment, but also the larger defeat of diminished expectation. The Navy's dominance of early years had been fueled by momentum and pride. Now that momentum had been arrested by an implacable, patient campaign that attacked the single most vital artery of modern empire, maritime logistics, in port offices and command centers alike, the realization had settled that military mastery requires more than valor. It requires the sustained capacity to move, feed, and repair. The empire that once fed on the sea now starved beside it. A single desk lamp threw a narrow cone of yellow across Admiral Charles Lockwood's table as he read patrol returns stacked like small battered books. Each report was a ledger of distance, speed, course, and tonnage, meticulous numbers that added up to a new geography of victory. Young lieutenants hovered in the doorway, their silhouettes like annotations against the night, and the Admiral's finger traced red ink where sinkings had clustered. The map they spread before him was dense with marks, not the dramatic arcs of fleet actions, but the patient surgical punctures of undersea interdiction. There was a quiet pride in the room, not boastful, but peculiar and brittle, because every victory had cost men in ways that nothing in the log could fully record. Radios hummed faintly with routine traffic, and the distant mechanical cough of engines on watch, a background tempo to the tally of success. Lockwood looked up and allowed himself a small private smile that was part relief and part astonishment. The instruments had been corrected, the doctrine refined, and the force had become ruthlessly efficient. The quiet that followed felt less like peace than the exhaustion after a long relay, and the papers on the desk smelled of diesel, ink, and salt. In that dimness, the scale of what had been accomplished began to feel both precise and strangely unreal. Across the room, Commander Richard O'Kane unfolded a chart that showed the Pacific covered in tiny red pins, where merchant tonnage once flowed freely. Each pin represented a shipment denied, a dock unfilled, a factory slowed, and the chart read like a census of absence. Men who had once feared failure now compared columns of tonnage with the clinical interest of accountants, calculating weeks saved and months lost to the enemy's supply chain. The human cost threaded through the numbers like a dark seam, visible if you knew where to look, invisible if you relied only on efficiency as measure. Staff officers debated whether the blockade's success should be broadcast for morale or muted for operational security, and their arguments were practical yet full of moral curvature. What they didn't yet know was how the abstract calculus of tonnage would translate into long-term political and social consequences for nations at war. Victory on charts had a blunt, useful clarity that the rest of life lacked. It solved an immediate problem while scattering questions about reconstruction and responsibility. Men drank their coffee and watched the sun rise, aware that the day's work would add more pins to that map or else refine how they hunted next. The sea had become a machine whose outputs were measured and logged, and those outputs reshaped the contours of conflict. The room momentarily was both triumphant and very tired. In a quieter office, the sonar logs were photocopied and bound for training manuals, pages that would change how future generations learned to listen to the deep. Sonar men who had once been background figures now lectured captains on the meaning of a faint return, on the difference between thermocline distortion and a genuine contact. Engineers annotated torpedo maintenance procedures with notes gleaned from patrols, how a gyro might drift in warmer currents, how a depth setting could change with salinity. The entire force had turned iterative. Patrol informed test, test informed doctrine, doctrine informed patrol. Where wartime orthodoxy had once been rigid, practice had turned doctrine into a living instrument that bent, adapted, and improved. Veterans who had seen early failures told younger crews of burned nights and broken detonators, as if recounting religious parables of humility. There was a hush when these lessons were shared, the kind of attention given to confession and to technical secret that saved lives. The institutional memory of the submarine force was no longer anecdotal but codified and replicable. In barracks and lecture halls alike, the culture of learning took hold with surprising speed and thoroughness by the time the next class of officers graduated. The old mistakes were footnotes in new manuals. On the forward deck of a returning boat, men watched waves roll where merchant lanes had once been crowded, and felt an odd dislocation between tactical success and the empty horizon. Salvage crews and dock workers who once worked in predictable cycles now found their labor redirected toward repairs and hull recovery, and the rhythm of port life had changed accordingly. Admirals in briefing rooms could speak eloquently about efficiency ratios and interdiction percentages, but dock foremen kept different metrics. The number of cranes idle this week, the length of queues at fuel depots, the sight of an apprentice turned to shore labor because orders were delayed. No one imagined that those shoreside measurements would one day define economic recovery more than any battlefield map ever could. The strategic advantage created by undersea mastery had consequences that spilled into grocery lines and hospital wards, and those consequences reshaped civilian expectations and political debates. The sea's silence had a cost that echoed in domestic policy meetings and in the quiet of provincial kitchens. In conferences where victory reports were toasted, small municipal councils calculated how long their supplies would last. The triumph at sea and the hardship ashore became two sides of the same ledger, connected by tin plate and rope rather than slogans. Mastery in the depths thus carried an irony. Strategic dominance produced a kind of moral and administrative complexity that no single naval victory could resolve. Rear admirals gathered in dim wards to read letters from survivors and from families, and the correspondence softened even the hardest tactical minds. A line in a sailor's letter, about a child's laugh or a garden waiting at home, pierced the numerical armor of commanders used to speaking in tons and miles. Those human fragments began to appear alongside battle reports and gave officers a new lens through which to assess victory. Men drafted speeches that acknowledged sacrifice while trying to avoid the bluntness of grief. They planted commemorative trees in bases and wrote names onto plaques mounted in hushed halls. The act of remembrance had become institutionalized precisely because the cost had been so visible and personal. Planners who once measured success purely by interdiction were now made self-conscious by ceremonies and by letters that moved even the most pragmatic to pause. What they didn't yet know was how those acts of memory would shape the post-war order, whether nations would translate grief into reconciliation or into further bitterness. For some, these memorials were salves. For others, they were reminders of what strategic efficiency had required in human terms. The Navy's record would be both proud and haunted, a ledger of effectiveness marked by the indelible ink of loss. In quiet moments on shore, engineers and former captains debated whether the methods developed in wartime should be taught unchanged to future generations or tempered by cautionary footnotes. They argued about the ethics of interdiction campaigns that targeted logistics rather than frontline forces, and about the line between strategic necessity and collective punishment. Some saw the submarine campaign as a model of disciplined application of technology and intelligence. Others noted how quickly the pressure on civilian life had mounted as a function of success. These discussions spilled into academic journals and naval colleges, where future officers would be taught both the techniques and the dilemmas of asymmetric maritime coercion. The war's technical triumph thus generated a literature of conscience as much as a manual of practice. Young cadets read case studies of sinkings and ration queues with equal attention, learning that effectiveness without judgment could have unexpected outcomes. No one imagined that such debates would become central to post-war naval thinking, but they did. Doctrine does not exist in a vacuum, and its consequences echo outward. The mastery developed in the depths therefore became a subject not only for engineers but for ethicists and lawmakers. That broader conversation was itself a kind of legacy, the intangible ripple a tactical victory leaves on civil society. At sea, boats continued patrols with an efficiency that bordered on ritual, captains and crews performing tasks whose logic had been refined to near-perfect repetition. Torpedo crews checked gyros by muscle memory, helmsmen held course to fractions of a degree, and sonar operators listened to the sea with an intimacy born of practice. Yet the ritual did not erase the odd afterthoughts that lingered at the edges of victory. Questions about rebuilding, about how nations would live after tonnage tallies no longer mattered. Strategists wrote reports that recommended maintaining a capable submarine force in peacetime as a hedge against future threat, and politicians nodded because the lessons were clear and useful. Civilians who had endured shortages and loss watched as the men who had done the hunting changed into veterans who would return home with skills and scars. Institutions that had been forged under pressure, shipyards, training centers, logistical corps, would become pillars in reconstruction or, in some places, contested sites of memory. The technical mastery of the war thus carried a second-order effect. It shaped post-war economies and careers in ways that were hard to predict but profound in consequence. For those who had been there, the ocean's lessons would not be relinquished lightly. They would be taught, archived and argued over for decades to come. In the end, the final patrol logs were filed, and the pins on the maps grew static as the last boats returned to peacetime slips. But the memory of what had been learned did not quiet. Commanders closed reports with standard language about mission accomplishment, but their marginal notes, terse observations about human cost, about the thin line between efficiency and excess, remained in drawers and later in memoirs. The sea had yielded to study and discipline, and in doing so, it had revealed itself as an instructor whose lessons were as ruthless as they were illuminating. Men celebrated victory and counted tonnage, and then they looked at the docks and the ration queues and understood that mastery carried a shadow. The tactical art of interdiction had become a demonstration of how quickly adaptation could turn failure into decisive advantage. They had conquered the silence, only to find it staring back. The film begins with an image of rusting steel, the hull of a Gato-class submarine, moored in quiet water, its paint flaking like dried blood in sunlight. A gull lands on the periscope housing, and the sound echoes hollow through the empty conning tower, the ghost of an engine room silent for 50 years. Inside, the air smells of salt and memory, and a plaque by the hatch lists names that no longer answer muster. Captain Richard O'Kane, now white-haired and thin, leans on a railing, eyes narrowing as if peering once again into sonar shadows. "We learned faster than they thought we could," he says, his voice a rasp more than a declaration. Around him a film crew moves carefully, reverent, knowing that every sound here feels borrowed. The submarine, once a machine of precision and hunger, now seems like a classroom turned mausoleum. O'Kane touches the cold metal and murmurs a name, not his own, before stepping back into the light. The camera pans upward. Gulls scatter, and for a heartbeat, the stillness feels like applause from the dead. The war, it seems, had ended, but its lessons never stopped teaching. In a lecture hall at Annapolis, decades later, a historian projects footage of sonar blips onto a curved wall, explaining how the U.S. Navy's wartime learning curve outpaced every other naval arm. Students sit in rows, notebooks open, eyes reflecting diagrams of angles, bearings, and probability lines. Adaptation, the lecturer says, tapping the pointer on the board, was the real weapon. Behind the statistics, 1,314 enemy ships sunk, 55% of Japan's merchant fleet gone, lies the quieter miracle of collective intelligence under fire. Manuals rewritten in mid-war, tactics redefined overnight, captains trained by failure rather than success. The screen shifts to photos of younger faces, some smiling, some ghost-like in the haze of history. The cadence of the historian's voice is calm but reverent, almost pastoral. He pauses at a photograph of Lockwood's staff huddled around a map and says, what they didn't yet know was that this speed, this improvisational mastery, would redefine modern warfare. Students scribble, but the room feels contemplative, not triumphant. The hum of the projector sounds faintly like the heartbeat of an engine long stilled. In an archive near Pearl Harbor, Dr. Elaine Matsuda, a naval historian, slides open a drawer of diaries and technical logs written in cramped, salt-stained handwriting. Each page carries the tremor of life under pressure. Notes about malfunctioning gyros, currents misjudged, enemy signals misread. The air is cool and dry to preserve what the sea once tried to erase. She reads aloud, "We thought we understood the ocean. It taught us otherwise." The words belong to an ensign who never returned, but whose analysis helped refine torpedo calibration for later missions. Around her, the sound of microfilm reels spinning fills the silence, history being replayed in mechanical whispers. The footage cuts to her typing notes, cross-referencing hand-drawn sonar traces with formal reports, the living bridging the thoughts of the dead. Knowledge, she says softly to herself, wasn't free. What no one imagined then was how the pace of learning born from desperation would later become the foundation for an entire century of military innovation. In a dim bar in San Diego, veterans gather once a year. Their conversations a mixture of jokes, silence, and small details that outsiders might mistake for trivia. Tom Delaney, once a torpedo mechanic, sets down his glass and mimics the whine of a gyro, the others laughing in recognition. Across the table, Chief Bruckner, the engineer who once stayed awake for 3 days testing detonators, simply nods and says, "That sound haunted my dreams for years." There's no bitterness in their talk, only the weight of understanding that mastery is never accidental. They toast those who never returned, but also the machines that once carried them, engines that rattled, valves that sang, steel that somehow kept them alive. The bartender refills glasses quietly. The room smells faintly of salt and tobacco. When the laughter fades, Delaney glances toward the window and says, "We got too good too fast." The line hangs there, heavier than the whiskey. Outside, the Pacific glows orange under streetlights, the same sea that once judged them all without mercy. What they didn't yet know was that the best lessons always arrive too late to save the men who first discover them. Old film reels show decommissioned submarines being cut open by sparks, acetylene torches biting through hulls that had once moved unseen through enemy waters. The narrator's voice, slow and deliberate, counts the years since the war: 20, 40, 70. The sequence dissolves between timelines, wartime footage of subs gliding through black surf and modern shots of the same hulls rusting in memorial parks. Children climb on conning towers now painted with museum gloss, unaware that beneath their hands once rested dials for destruction. Visitors read plaques that reduce vast suffering to a few dignified sentences. For the veterans who come to stand before them, it feels both sacred and insufficient. Each artifact, a torpedo propeller, a logbook, a coffee mug fused with salt, becomes a question how much knowledge should survive and how much should be allowed to sleep. The sea nearby laps gently, no longer hostile, yet its rhythm feels unchanged. Time erodes metal, but not memory. Historians today describe the submarine war as a masterclass in adaptive engineering under existential pressure. Admiral Lockwood's post-war memos, now unclassified, reveal an obsession with iteration, a refusal to let failure repeat. "We turned data into instinct," one line reads, a phrase that could summarize the entire campaign. Analysts studying this period cite the feedback loop between field reports and design revisions. As a precursor to modern systems thinking, war had forced learning into real time, errors fixed in weeks, tactics rewritten overnight, survival transformed into science. Yet within those efficiencies lay the paradox of mastery. The faster the system learned, the greater its detachment from the people inside it. Officers began to speak of the machine as if it were alive, as though the process itself had taken command. What they didn't yet know was that this pattern, human intuition feeding automation, would define wars to come. The blueprint of adaptation forged beneath Pacific waves became the architecture of a new world. In a small museum room, glass cases display the personal notebooks of sailors, open to pages where ink has blurred but meaning endures. Target at 310 degrees, one line reads, depth 80 feet, sea calm, fear constant. The handwriting trembles not from the penmanship of youth, but from the motion of the sea itself, a heartbeat written into history. Visitors linger longer here than before, the medals and models drawn to the handwriting, the humanity between statistics. A curator explains that the ink used aboard submarines often ran when humidity rose, leaving ghost-like fingerprints alongside technical entries. Even their mistakes survived, she says, and smiles faintly. On a nearby screen, faded footage plays, an admiral saluting the crews who never came home, the sea behind him, a mirror of light and memory. The camera pans upward to the horizon, the same horizon those men once watched through periscopes. No one imagined that their handwriting would outlast their weapons. As the documentary nears its end, the narrator's voice slows, drawing the viewer back into the calm that follows revelation. The ocean rolls quietly on screen, indifferent as ever, the color of steel and forgiveness. Over this stillness, we hear voices, snippets of interviews, logbook readings, classroom lectures, blending into a single human chorus of remembrance and understanding. The story of American submarines becomes more than a tale of machinery and victory. It becomes an anatomy of learning itself, swift, relentless, costly. The final montage lingers on rusted hulls and unmailed letters, the quiet proof that innovation is never free. In the distance, gulls call, faint, cyclical, eternal. Knowledge won the war, the narrator says, voice barely above a whisper. But memory kept its price. The waves fold over the words like closing pages, and for a moment it is hard to tell whether the sea is breathing or simply remembering. The morning light falls soft over the Pacific, as a thin line of veterans stands at the rail of a grey-hulled ship, the water calm enough to hold reflection like glass. Each man holds a wreath, white flowers tied with fading ribbon, American stars on one, a rising sun on another. No words are spoken at first. The engines hum low, the ocean breathes slow, and gulls wheel far above the silence. Admiral Richard O'Kane, now bowed by age, grips the rail with both hands, knuckles pale against the metal he once commanded. Beside him stands Masaru Saito, a former Japanese submarine captain who traveled across an ocean to be here. His cap tucked beneath his arm, his uniform replaced by plain grey cloth. When they nod to each other, it feels less like forgiveness than recognition. Two men who once fought the same indifferent sea, the wreaths touch the surface and drift apart, before circling back together in a slow, perfect spiral. Around them the Pacific is vast and indifferent. Yet in its calm there is something sacred, an unspoken truce older than nations. Cameras remain still, respecting the silence that belongs to no one but the waves. In that silence memory breathes, heavy, eternal, and kind. Far below, sunlight filters through blue depths, scattering like fine dust over the skeletons of ships long surrendered to the sea. Hulls that once bore flags and purpose now lie draped in coral and sea fans, their gun barrels crusted with life. Small fish dart through open hatches once sealed tight against the world, and a moray eel slips between rivets where once engineers listened for depth charges. The sea, relentless in its patience, has turned destruction into sanctuary, each wreck an accidental reef, each rivet a monument. A rusted torpedo, its propeller frozen in a final spin, lies half buried in sand. Nearby, a cracked helmet rests upside down, now home to a small anemone. No one imagined this transformation, that steel born for war would one day cradle life so delicate it trembles in the current. Divers who visit speak of a hush, a stillness that feels like being inside prayer. They say you can almost hear the hum of forgotten engines, like a memory the ocean refuses to release. Down here, names no longer matter, only the rhythm of tide and time. The sea, impartial as ever, keeps both victors and victims with equal tenderness. On land, memorials stand where waves can be heard faintly beyond the horizon. Granite, bronze, and weathered wood etched with coordinates instead of cemeteries. In Hawaii, widows press their palms against engraved names. In Yokosuka, schoolchildren trace the same across decades. These rituals have become a shared language, a conversation between silence and remembrance. A priest in pearl robes murmurs sutras beside a Japanese monument, while an American chaplain in khaki reads a psalm. Their voices drift into the same wind and dissolve over the same sea. Around them, families hold photographs, some black and white, others fading color, and in the faces of the lost, the difference between flags vanishes. The camera lingers on the reflection of sunlight in tear tracks, each glimmer momentary, each true. What they didn't yet know, those sailors of 1945, was that their absence would bind strangers together in reverence instead of rage. A nation's grief, when stretched across generations, becomes less about blame and more about belonging to a story no one fully owns. The monuments stand not as reminders of conquest but of cost. At a naval museum in Washington, a curator arranges artifacts beneath glass: a dented stopwatch, a pilot's logbook, a folded flag stained by oil. Children press their hands against the case, their reflections merging with the faint outlines of those who once used these tools. A film plays in looping silence. Submarines slipping beneath waves, sailors waving from decks, the ocean swallowing them whole. Elderly visitors sit quietly through the footage, their faces turned toward the screen, but their thoughts years away. "We were so young," one whispers, though no one had asked him. The curator explains to a reporter that the collection isn't about weapons, but about the rhythm of human ingenuity, how quickly men learned, how deeply they paid. Knowledge preserved in brass and steel becomes memory preserved in hearts. What no one imagined was that museums would someday serve as sanctuaries for peace, not for the stories of domination, but for the fragile bridge of empathy built from understanding. Outside, flags ripple in a gentle breeze, and from somewhere distant, the faint sound of waves can be heard against concrete. In a classroom in Tokyo, a teacher dims the lights and plays a recording of underwater footage taken near Truk Lagoon. The children watch the wrecks drift into view, shadows of submarines and cargo ships now gilded with coral. "This," she says softly, "is what silence looks like." She explains that the ocean does not forget, it only transforms metal into reef, memory into song. The students write essays about peace, drawing submarines not as monsters but as relics of caution. One boy writes that he hopes fish swim through both American and Japanese ships without knowing the difference. When she reads it aloud, the class is quiet, not from grief, but from understanding. In that small moment, the vast history of two nations folds into the shared imagination of children. No one applauds because reverence asks for stillness, not sound. Outside the window, the Pacific gleams faintly, eternal, unjudging, and alive. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, wreaths drift toward the Arizona Memorial as bugles sound and hands rise to salute. Among the crowd stands Aya Takahashi, daughter of a Japanese engineer lost in the war, her hand trembling as she mirrors the gesture of the veterans beside her. The ceremony, long international now, carries the weight of accumulated decades. Each year fewer survivors, each note of the hymn more fragile. The air smells of salt and flowers, waves lap softly beneath the platform, whispering in a language older than history. Admiral Lockwood's name is read aloud beside those of his men, and for a fleeting second rank disappears. The veterans lower their heads, not out of pride but because the sea has taught them humility. For them, victory had never been absolute. It had always been borrowed, temporary, conditional upon remembrance. The camera pans over the water's surface where oil still shimmers, a slow, silent heartbeat of a world learning how to grieve properly. Above it all, the gulls circle like old sentinels, calling out to those who once sailed beneath. Far below, where no light reaches, the remnants of hulls lie side by side, Japanese and American separated by sediment, united by stillness. Marine biologists exploring the depths find that coral has fused across the wrecks, blurring their edges until nationality becomes meaningless. The fish do not discriminate. The sea refuses to categorize. The current drifts through corridors once filled with orders, now filled with life. Each ripple is an echo of propeller wash, a whisper of what once was motion, now memory. In this quiet graveyard, balance has returned, nature reclaiming what men once tried to dominate. Divers pause before plaques left by families and press fingertips to barnacled steel in the universal language of touch. No anthem plays here, only the rhythm of air bubbles rising toward a surface they may never reach. It is perhaps the most honest memorial of all, not built by hands, but by time itself. As evening descends, the camera pulls wide, the Pacific stretching endless and calm, sun melting into horizon. Voices from ceremonies fade into surf and wind until only the ocean remains, speaking in the language of patience. The narrator's tone lowers, reflective, the words carried like waves that refuse to hurry. The sea remembers, he says quietly, not as men remember, with stories and flags, but with silence. The view lingers on wreaths drifting, the white petals dissolving into twilight blue. Above, stars begin to appear, faint and innumerable, like souls resurfacing through the dark. Every wreck, every name, every lesson rests now beneath those constellations, equal, eternal, and still. The film fades to the sound of water against hull, gentle as breathing, steady as time. In the stillness of the Pacific, the narrator concludes, they are all remembered, hunters and hunted alike. A Virginia-class submarine slipped beneath glassy water, its sail cutting a bright line through the early morning like a blade through silk. On the forward deck, technicians checked external fittings while the captain, Commander Elena Park, watched instruments that registered depth and bearing with surgical calm. The engine hummed at a whisper, not the roar of old diesels, and the hull moved with the deliberate patience of a creature that knows its world. Through a small porthole, a junior officer watched archival footage on a tablet. black and white periscopes, wartime crews, and the battered Gato-class boats that had once learned their craft under fire. The two images, present and past, overlapped in the officer's mind like pages of a living book. The modern boat's sonar readouts were tighter and clearer than any in 1943, but the questions they answered were the same. Where is the line between observation and action, between knowledge and consequence? In the wardroom, sailors traded quiet stories about grandfathers and mentors who had taught them to listen to the sea. For them, technology was a tool, and memory was an instruction manual written in salt and iron. The submarine surfaced then, just long enough for the crew to feel wind and sunlight, and they looked at the horizon the way men have always looked at the ocean, searching for meaning as much as targets. Outside, waves folded and unfolded like pages, patient and indifferent. On shore, an archivist named Dr. Haruto Sakamoto curated film reels and sonar logs, cataloguing the evolution of doctrine from improvisation to institution. He played a reel where Lockwood's hand traced a map and then paused on a shot of exhausted engineers soldering a torpedo detonator by lamplight. Students crowded around him, watching the grainy images as if watching ancestors perform a rite. Dr. Sakamoto pointed out the chain of cause and effect. Failure bred experiments. Experiments birthed doctrine. Doctrine reshaped the war. He emphasized technical specifics. Gyro drift corrected by a shim here, a manual depth override there. Because the details explained how practice became power. The classroom felt sacred, a place where the cost of knowledge was taught alongside its mechanics. What they didn't yet know, he told them softly, was how the ethics of such learning would burden future generations, who would inherit both its techniques and its dilemmas. Outside the archive window, the ocean lay calm, a silent teacher that had already shaped nations. Students closed notebooks with a new kind of respect, aware that mastery is always shadowed by consequence. The reel clicked off and the projector hummed like a distant engine, leaving the room steeped in reflective silence. Veterans' reunions scattered across harbours showed men who had once listened for pings, now listening for names in roll calls at memorials. At a pier in Norfolk, old sailors saluted as a new generation lowered wreaths into the same water that had tested them decades before. Faces lined with age smiled when young officers asked about patrol life, and frowned when conversations turned to the moral calculus of interdiction. Captain O'Kane's granddaughter asked quietly whether victory felt like triumph or like loss, and his gaze lingered on the horizon before answering. Both, he said, because to win we had to learn quickly, and sometimes that meant paying a price. The maps never showed. Around him, men nodded in slow agreement. Memory is collective, but grief is still individual. In Japan, former escort commanders attended similar ceremonies and kept to themselves when asked about responsibility and regret. The rituals mirrored one another, flags folded, names read aloud, bells tolled, wreaths dropped and drifted into the same indifferent sea. The shared gestures suggested a kind of international translation of sorrow, different languages naming the same absence. In those moments, the political boundaries that had once defined the fight felt thin compared to the human geography of loss. Historians later traced the rapid organizational learning of 1942-44 and argued it presaged modern ideas about rapid iteration and systems thinking. Academic papers cited torpedo fixes and wolfpack coordination as early examples of feedback loops that turned field data into doctrine. With unprecedented speed, panels at naval colleges debated the balance between innovation and ethics, and young officers wrestled publicly with questions their mentors had once discussed quietly. Policy papers recommended retaining peacetime training that preserved the habit of rigorous adaptation, but warned against glorifying every means to an end. In think tanks, analysts mapped the genealogy of learning from torpedo workshops to cyber warfare labs, drawing a line through decades of military change. Governments weighed the benefits of rapid adaptation against the political costs of civilian suffering that could accompany logistical targeting. No one imagined this would become the template for later conflicts, where speed of learning and technological control could determine outcomes as much as manpower. The footnotes of wartime memos found their way into peacetime doctrine and into export markets of military technology and strategy. Yet, at the center of every policy sit the same human questions. What do we owe the present to protect the future, and how do we live with the costs incurred? The sea's lesson was not only technical, it was a lesson in humility about the limits of human design. Modern navies built on that legacy: quieter hulls, better hydrodynamics, and sensors that could hear the faintest mechanical whisper. But they also inherited cautionary tales recorded in memorials and diaries. In shipyards, apprentices learned to maintain propulsion systems whose power was measured in shaft horsepower and silent efficiency. And they read wartime entries to understand why tolerance mattered down to a fraction of an inch. The technology evolved. Electric drivetrains replaced noisier engines, sonar arrays expanded bandwidth, and computers could model thermal layers that once fooled sonar men. Engineers like Maria Alvarez, now chief of acoustic systems, traced her methods back to those early manual adjustments, a living lineage from hands-on fixes to digital precision. Yet every technical advance also made decisions more remote. Commanders could strike from farther away and do so with less immediate human visibility. The art of warfare had become partly mechanical and partly bureaucratic, mediated by displays and code rather than solely by men's eyes and ears. Survivors who visit modern boats sometimes remark that the technology makes things easier and harsher at once. Easier to kill, harsher to forget. The sense of mastery is therefore double-edged. It protects, and it detaches. It instructs, and it absolves. In training centers, instructors teach both skill and restraint, understanding that knowledge without judgment is dangerous. The ocean remains a teacher whose syllabus includes both method and morality, and that curriculum is ongoing. In coastal towns, grandchildren of sailors comb old boxes and find letters that read like catechisms of courage and curiosity. Small text that shaped family stories for generations. Museums display those letters beside sonar displays, bridging private grief with public history. In a way that is deliberate and solemn, scholars compile oral histories and discover patterns of decision-making that had been invisible in official reports, but clear in the cadence of everyday recollection. Policymakers consult these compilations for lessons in crisis management and for warnings about the social cost of purely technical victory. Communities erect small plaques where elders once prayed, and the plaques are written in languages that did not speak to one another during the conflict. What they didn't yet know as the decades passed was how resilient memory could be, how it would persist in neighborhood songs and schoolbooks even as political winds shifted. The persistence of remembrance shaped reconciliation efforts, inviting former adversaries to shared ceremonies where stories were exchanged rather than only military histories. These acts did not erase grief but reframed it into shared human language, reducing strangers into fellow bearers of memory. The ripple effects reached policy. Veteran care programs, cross-national memorial exchanges, and the inclusion of ethical modules in military training all trace back to these grassroots memories. The sea's lesson thus proved durable not only in hardware but in human habits of attention and remembrance. On a quiet morning, a veteran and a young officer stood together on a bluff and watched a Navy exercise where modern submarines glided like silent whales beneath a flat sky. The veteran traced his finger across the horizon and told the officer about a night when sonar had been only a promise and the men had listened with their hands on the hull. The officer bowed his head and later transcribed the story into a digital log that would be archived and queried by future students. There is comfort in continuity, in the idea that lessons learned can be passed forward and that human experience can temper technical might. But there is also a warning in that continuity. As systems grow complex, the signals that matter can be buried beneath layers of abstraction and protocol. Researchers warn that the same speed of learning that once produced advantage could, in another context, accelerate harm if divorced from oversight and compassion. Communities now debate how to teach history without hardening young officers into techno-optimists who prioritize efficacy over ethics. The balance sought is subtle and ongoing, a negotiation between prudence and preparedness, memory and invention. No one imagined the aftershocks of wartime adaptation would reach so far into peacetime life and thought, but they have, shaping law, education, and even art. The ocean, patient as ever, continues to calibrate human ambition with its own unfathomable measure. As the sun set, archival images dissolved into present-day footage, periscopes into periscopes, sailors into students, engines into quiet humming machines, and the film folded time into a single long arc. The camera lingered on waves that folded over themselves, patient as seasons, keeping the memory of engines and letters beneath their skin. In quiet rooms, people debated doctrine, and in small kitchens, families memorialized forebears with meals cooked from ration-era recipes. Technical mastery had been achieved, and with it, a sober recognition that mastery is accompanied always by consequence. Men and nations had learned lessons in the deep that reshaped navies and societies, and those lessons would be taught for generations. The story was not merely one of victory or of loss, but of a complicated human process. Learning, adapting, remembering, and reckoning. The ocean remained the ultimate witness, indifferent to flags but intimate with fate, its surface reflecting the slow ache of history. We close then on the same horizon where the story began, where waves fold endlessly and the sea listens. Once men taught the ocean how to fight, in time the ocean taught them how to remember. The camera pans up to a sky full of stars, and the film fades on a sea that keeps both lesson and silence in equal measure.